When you think about reality, knowledge, justice, or the soul, you are walking paths that Plato carved out 2,400 years ago. Born around 427 before the Common Era in Athens, Plato stands as perhaps the single most influential philosopher in Western history. Every major philosophical question we grapple with today, from what makes something beautiful to how we should organize society, bears his fingerprints. But here is what makes Plato genuinely radical. He argued that everything you see, touch, and experience is not truly real, that the physical world is merely a shadow of a higher reality accessible only through reason. This was not mysticism or religious doctrine. It was a carefully reasoned philosophical position that would influence everyone from early Christians to modern scientists, from medieval scholars to contemporary cognitive scientists. Plato wrote not as a systematic philosopher delivering dry treatises, but as a dramatist who placed his teacher Socrates at the centre of dialogues that read like intellectual thrillers. Through these conversations, Plato tackled questions that remain urgent. What is justice, and why should we care about it? What is knowledge, and how does it differ from mere opinion? Can we have a perfect society, and what would it look like? Understanding Plato means understanding the intellectual foundation of Western civilization. His academy in Athens, founded around 387 before the Common Era, lasted for over 900 years and became the prototype for every university that followed. When we debate about education, politics, ethics, or truth itself, we are continuing conversations that Plato started. This exploration will take you deep into the architecture of Plato's thought. We will examine not just what he believed, but why he believed it, where his reasoning succeeds brilliantly, where it falters, and how scholars have debated these ideas across millennia. We will see how his philosophy applies to contemporary problems, and why, after all these centuries, we still cannot escape his shadow. Part 1. The Theory of Forms, Reality Beyond Reality. Imagine you are looking at 3 different chairs, one wooden, one metal, one plastic. They look different, they are made of different materials, they serve slightly different purposes. Yet somehow, instantly, you recognize all 3 as chairs. How is this possible, Plato asked, if there is no single physical thing that all chairs have in common? His answer revolutionized philosophy and planted the seeds for debates that continue today. Plato proposed that beyond our physical world exists another realm, a realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms or ideas. These forms are not mental concepts or abstractions, they are more real than anything you can touch. Every chair you see is merely an imperfect copy, a shadow, of the perfect form of chair that exists in this higher realm. The particular chairs decay, break, and cease to exist, but the form of chair is eternal and unchanging. This applies to everything. There is a form of beauty itself, not just beautiful things. There is a form of justice itself, not just individual just acts. There is a form of goodness itself, which Plato considered the highest form, the source of all other forms and the ultimate reality. When we call something beautiful, we are actually recognizing that it participates in or resembles the form of beauty. When we call an action just, we are recognizing its relationship to the form of justice. Here is where Plato gets truly radical. He argued that this physical world we inhabit, the world of particular things that we see and touch, is less real than the world of forms. Physical objects are constantly changing, they are born and they die. They are never quite what they seem. The forms, by contrast, are eternal, perfect, and fully real. In his famous allegory of the cave from the Republic, Plato compared us to prisoners chained in a cave. watching shadows on a wall and mistaking those shadows for reality, never realizing that real objects exist outside in the sunlight. Let us make this concrete with an example from mathematics, which Plato loved. When you think of a perfect circle, you are not thinking of any physical circle you have ever drawn or seen. Every drawn circle has imperfections, tiny deviations from perfect circularity. Yet you can understand what a perfect circle is, you can reason about its properties, you can prove theorems about it. Plato would say that is because you are accessing the form of circle through reason, a form that exists independently of any physical representation. The drawn circles are imperfect copies, the mathematical circle is the real thing. This theory explains how knowledge is possible at all. If everything in the physical world is constantly changing, how can we have stable knowledge about anything? Plato's answer: knowledge is not about the changing physical world, but about the eternal forms. When we learn geometry, we are not learning about physical shapes, but about the forms themselves. When we learn what justice truly is, we are grasping the form of justice, not just collecting examples of just actions. The forms also provided Plato with a solution to ethical relativism, the idea that moral values are just cultural preferences with no objective foundation. If justice itself exists as a form, then justice is not whatever society says it is. There is an objective standard against which we can measure our actions and our societies. This makes Plato one of the first and most powerful defenders of moral objectivism, the view that some things are truly right or wrong regardless of what anyone thinks. But how do we access these forms if they exist in a separate realm? Here Plato introduces one of his most beautiful and controversial ideas, recollection or remembrance. In the dialogue Meno, Socrates demonstrates that an uneducated slave boy can work out geometric truths through questioning alone. Plato concluded that learning is actually remembering. He believed our souls existed in the realm of forms before birth, directly experiencing these eternal truths. When we are born into the physical world, we forget what we knew. But education is the process of remembering, of recovering knowledge the soul already possesses. This doctrine of recollection connects to Plato's theory of the soul. He believed the soul is immortal and belongs fundamentally to the realm of forms. The soul is trapped in the body like a prisoner, and the philosopher's task is to free the soul through reason and contemplation, to turn it away from the deceptive physical world toward the eternal truths. When we die, the soul returns to its proper realm, though it may be reborn again in another body, depending on how philosophically and virtuously we lived. Now let us examine where this theory encounters serious problems, because understanding Plato's failures is as important as understanding his successes. The most famous critique comes from Plato's own student, Aristotle, who found the theory of forms both unnecessary and incoherent. Aristotle asked, if there is a form of human that all individual humans participate in, what about the form itself? Does it participate in a higher form of human, and so on infinitely? This is called the third man argument, and it suggests the theory leads to an infinite regress. Another devastating problem: how exactly do particular things participate in forms? Plato used various metaphors. Physical objects imitate forms, they participate in forms, they resemble forms. But these are just metaphors. What is the actual relationship? If a form is completely separate from the physical world, how does it have any connection to physical things at all? If it is not separate, then it is just another physical thing and loses its eternal, perfect character. This participation problem has never been satisfactorily resolved. The theory also struggles with what we might call the garbage forms problem. If there is a form for every category of thing, is there a form of mud, a form of hair, a form of disease? Plato himself worried about this in his later dialogue Parmenides. It seems implausible that negative or trivial things have eternal, perfect forms. But if we restrict forms only to important or valuable things, we lose the theory's explanatory power for why we can categorize anything at all. Contemporary scholars debate whether Plato even held a single consistent theory of forms or whether his views evolved. Early dialogues seem to present forms as separate substances, but later dialogues like Parmenides and Sophist show Plato wrestling with the theory's problems. Some scholars argue he abandoned or radically revised the theory. Others claim he was always aware of its difficulties and presented them for readers to grapple with. This interpretive debate matters because it affects how we understand Plato's entire philosophical project. Yet despite these problems, the theory of forms has proven astonishingly influential and productive. Modern mathematics and logic operate with abstract objects that behave remarkably like Platonic forms. Mathematicians discover properties of numbers and geometric objects that exist independently of physical reality. When a mathematician proves that there are infinitely many prime numbers, they are proving something about abstract mathematical objects, not about physical collections of things. This has led many contemporary philosophers of mathematics to embrace various forms of Platonism. In cognitive science and linguistics, something like Plato's forms appears in the concept of prototypes and categories. Research shows that we categorize things by comparing them to idealized mental representations. When you identify something as a chair, your brain is comparing it to an ideal or prototypical chair representation. While these mental prototypes are not eternal forms in another realm, the structure of the explanation is remarkably Platonic. Even in physics we find Platonic echoes. The laws of nature, mathematical equations that govern physical processes, seem to exist independently of the physical universe itself. Physicists discover rather than invent these laws. The law of gravity was true before Newton formulated it, and would remain true even if the physical universe ceased to exist. This suggests something like a Platonic realm of mathematical truth underlying physical reality. The ethical implications of the theory of forms remain vital today. If there are objective moral truths that exist independently of human opinion, then moral progress is possible, and moral error is real. We can say that a society that practiced slavery was objectively wrong, not just different. We can strive to understand justice better and create more just institutions. Without something like Plato's forms, many philosophers argue, we are left with mere preference or power determining what counts as good or right. But this raises a troubling question that has divided scholars for centuries. How do we know what the forms are if we cannot see them directly? Plato's answer was reason, philosophical contemplation guided by dialectic, the method of question and answer. Yet history shows that brilliant philosophers, reasoning carefully, have reached radically different conclusions about justice, beauty, and goodness. If reason alone could reveal the forms, why is there so much disagreement? This epistemological problem, the problem of how we know anything about forms, remains one of the deepest challenges to Platonic philosophy. Some contemporary Platonists have tried to rescue the theory by naturalizing it. Perhaps forms are not in a separate realm, but are abstract patterns that physical things instantiate, patterns that exist wherever they are exemplified. This preserves the objectivity Plato wanted, while avoiding the mystical separate realm. But critics respond that this sacrifices what made Plato's theory distinctive and powerful. The claim that there is a reality more real than the physical world, accessible through reason alone. The theory of forms ultimately reveals both Plato's genius and his limitations. He saw correctly that we need some account of how abstract thought connects to reality, how mathematics can be objective, how moral truths can transcend cultural preferences. His proposed solution, a realm of perfect eternal forms, was bold and systematic. But it created as many problems as it solved, problems about how we access this realm, how it relates to the physical world, and whether it makes coherent sense at all. Yet even in its failures, the theory of forms set the agenda for Western philosophy, forcing every subsequent thinker to grapple with the relationship between the abstract and the concrete, between thought and reality, between the eternal and the changing. Part 2. Epistemology and the divided line. What can we really know? Plato recognized a fundamental problem that keeps philosophers awake at night. How do you distinguish between genuine knowledge and mere opinion or belief? If someone believes the earth is flat and someone else knows it is spherical, what makes one belief knowledge and the other ignorance? Is it just that one happens to be correct? Plato said no, knowledge requires something more, something that transforms a lucky guess into genuine understanding. In the Republic, Plato presents his famous image of the divided line, a geometric diagram that maps both the levels of reality and the corresponding levels of human cognition. He divides existence into two major realms, the visible world and the intelligible world. Then he subdivides each realm into two further levels, creating four distinct stages of awareness. The lowest level, the realm of images and shadows, corresponds to imagination or conjecture. This is where we deal with reflections, shadows, artistic representations and illusions. When you look at a painting of a horse, you are operating at this level. The painting is not even a real horse. It is an image of a horse twice removed from reality. Most people spend their lives at this level, Plato thought, mistaking representations for reality itself, like prisoners in the cave watching shadows and thinking those shadows are the whole world. The second level is the realm of physical objects, corresponding to belief or conviction. Here we interact with actual things, real horses, real trees, real people. This is better than dealing with mere images, but it is still not knowledge. Why not? Because physical things are constantly changing, and knowledge must be of something stable and eternal. You can have a correct belief about a physical thing. You can believe correctly that your car is parked outside, but this belief lacks the permanence and certainty that characterizes genuine knowledge. The third level marks our entry into the intelligible realm, the world of forms. This is the level of mathematical reasoning and hypothetical thinking. When mathematicians work with numbers and geometric shapes, they are reasoning about eternal truths. 2 + 2 = 4 was true before humans existed and will remain true after we are gone. However, Plato thought even this level has limitations. Mathematicians start with unproven assumptions, with hypotheses they accept without full justification, and then reason forward. They know truths, but they do not fully understand the foundations of those truths. The highest level is the realm of pure forms grasped through dialectic, corresponding to true knowledge or understanding. This is where the philosopher operates, using reason to grasp the forms themselves without relying on physical examples or unexamined assumptions. At this level, the knower understands not just that something is true, but why it must be true, how it relates to other truths, and ultimately how everything connects to the form of the good. This is episteme, genuine knowledge, contrasted with doxa, mere opinion. The distinction between knowledge and opinion was crucial for Plato. Opinion can be about changing things and can be false, while knowledge must be about eternal truths and cannot be false. You cannot truly know that your friend is standing next to you right now, because that is a temporary fact, about the physical world. You can only have a correct belief about it, but you can truly know that justice is a virtue, because that is a fact about eternal forms. This epistemology has a radical implication that Plato embraced fully. Most of what we think we know, we do not actually know. Our beliefs about the physical world, about particular people and events, about what happened yesterday or what will happen tomorrow, all of this falls short of genuine knowledge. True knowledge is rare and difficult, accessible only to those who turn away from the physical world and contemplate eternal truths through philosophical reasoning. Plato also introduced the concept of the analogy between knowledge and sight. Just as the sun makes physical objects visible to the eye, the form of the good makes the forms intelligible to the mind. Without the good, we could not understand any truth at all. The good is the source of both being and intelligibility, the ultimate principle that makes everything else possible. This connection between epistemology and metaphysics, between knowing and being, became a defining feature of Western philosophy. But here is where serious problems emerge. The most obvious difficulty is that Plato's theory makes knowledge incredibly rare, perhaps impossibly so. If we can only have knowledge of eternal forms, not of the changing physical world, then we cannot know most of what we care about. We cannot know historical facts, scientific observations, or anything about particular people and situations. A doctor could not have knowledge about your particular illness, only opinions based on observation. This seems to evacuate the concept of knowledge of its practical value. Aristotle forcefully challenged this aspect of Plato's theory. He argued that we can have genuine knowledge of the physical world precisely because physical things have stable natures or essences. We can have scientific knowledge about how animals grow, how plants reproduce, how objects fall, because these processes follow regular patterns. We do not need a separate realm of forms to ground this knowledge. Aristotle's empiricism, the view that knowledge comes from careful observation and induction, has proven far more productive for science than Plato's rationalism. The epistemology also creates what philosophers call the problem of access. If genuine knowledge requires direct rational insight into eternal forms, how do we know when we have achieved this insight versus merely believing we have? Plato described philosophical enlightenment as like suddenly seeing clearly after being blind. But this is just a metaphor. Different philosophers claim to have rational insight into contradictory truths. Without some independent way to verify that we have grasped a form correctly, we are stuck in a kind of epistemological isolation, unable to confirm our own knowledge. Contemporary epistemologists have mostly rejected Plato's sharp distinction between knowledge and opinion. Modern theories typically define knowledge as justified true belief with some additional condition to rule out lucky guesses. You can have knowledge about particular facts if you have good reasons for believing them and they happen to be true. This makes knowledge both more achievable and more relevant to practical life than Plato's austere conception allowed. However, Plato's epistemology identified some genuine and lasting insights. He was right that there is a difference between merely having a true belief and understanding why it is true. If you believe the earth is spherical because your parents told you so, and I believe it because I understand the evidence and reasoning, there is an important epistemic difference between us, even if we both have true beliefs. Modern epistemology captures this with concepts like epistemic justification and understanding. Plato also correctly identified that some knowledge seems independent of experience. Mathematical and logical truths appear to be knowable through reason alone, without observing the physical world. 2 + 2 = 4. not because we have observed many pairs of pairs, but because we can see through reason that it must be true. This has led many philosophers to accept that some knowledge is a priori, knowable independently of experience, even if they reject Plato's metaphysical explanation involving forms. The divided line reveals another crucial Platonic insight, that cognition comes in degrees. We can think more or less clearly, more or less deeply, about the same subject matter. Understanding a mathematical proof is different from memorizing it. Grasping why a moral principle is correct is different from just following rules. Educational systems worldwide implicitly accept this Platonic hierarchy when they distinguish between rote learning and genuine understanding, between facts and comprehension. In contemporary philosophy of mind, something resembling Plato's epistemology appears in debates about conceptual knowledge versus empirical knowledge. We seem to have a different kind of access to conceptual truths, like that bachelors are unmarried, than to empirical truths, like that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Conceptual truths seem knowable through understanding alone, while empirical truths require observation. This distinction echoes Plato's separation between knowledge of forms and belief about physical particulars, though without the metaphysical baggage of a separate realm. The epistemology also connects to education in ways that remain influential. Plato believed education is not putting knowledge into empty minds, but drawing out knowledge the soul already possesses. Good teaching involves asking questions that help students discover truths for themselves rather than simply telling them facts. The Socratic method of teaching through questioning, still used in law schools and philosophy classes, embodies this Platonic conviction that understanding must come from within rather than being externally imposed. Yet we must confront the authoritarian danger lurking in Plato's epistemology. If genuine knowledge is rare and difficult, accessible only to philosophers who have ascended to contemplate forms, then everyone else must rely on the guidance of these philosophical experts. This creates a natural hierarchy with philosopher-knowers at the top and opinion holders below. Plato explicitly embraced this conclusion, arguing that philosophers should rule precisely because they alone possess knowledge. But this raises the troubling question of how non-philosophers can recognize genuine philosophers when they see them, if they themselves lack knowledge. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider disagreement among supposed experts. Throughout history, philosophers and intellectuals claiming rational insight into eternal truths have contradicted each other on virtually every important question. If Plato's epistemology were correct, only one of them could have genuine knowledge while the others merely have opinions. But without a reliable method for identifying who has knowledge, we are left with competing claims to authority with no way to adjudicate between them. Modern democratic epistemology takes a different approach, recognizing that knowledge is often distributed across communities rather than concentrated in individuals. Scientists build knowledge collectively through peer review, replication, and cumulative research. Moral and political wisdom may emerge from democratic deliberation rather than philosophical insight. This view rejects Plato's hierarchical epistemology in favor of a more egalitarian conception of knowledge production. Nevertheless, Plato's central epistemological question remains urgent. How do we distinguish between genuine understanding and mere belief, between wisdom and the appearance of wisdom? In an age of misinformation, where confident assertions flood social media and expertise is routinely dismissed, we desperately need ways to identify real knowledge. Plato may have gotten the answer wrong, but he identified a problem that every society must solve to function well. His epistemology challenges us to think seriously about what knowledge is, how we attain it, and who should be trusted with authority based on it. Part 3. Political Philosophy and Justice, the Soul Writ Large. Plato wrote, "The Republic not primarily as a political treatise, but as an answer to a moral question. What is justice, and why should a person be just rather than unjust?" His answer revolutionized political philosophy by connecting individual morality inextricably to social organization. To understand the just person, Plato argued, we must first understand the just city, because the city is like the soul writ large, its structure more visible and easier to analyze. The challenge Plato faced came from thinkers like Thrasymachus, who appears in the Republic arguing that justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. Rulers make laws to benefit themselves, call those laws just, and punish anyone who disobeys as unjust. Justice, in this view, is just a tool the powerful use to control the weak. The truly smart person would appear just to avoid punishment while secretly pursuing their own advantage. This is the position of the sophisticated immoralist, and Plato knew he had to defeat it completely or abandon the idea that morality has any rational foundation. An even more dangerous challenge came from Glaucon, who tells the story of the ring of Gyges. A shepherd finds a ring that makes him invisible and uses it to seduce the queen, murder the king, and seize power. Glaucon argues that anyone with such a ring, freed from the consequences of their actions, would abandon justice entirely. We are just only because we fear punishment, not because justice is valuable in itself. If this is true, then justice is irrational, something we endure because we must, not something we should choose because it makes us better. Plato's response was to show that justice is intrinsically valuable, that it makes the soul harmonious and well-ordered, regardless of external rewards or punishments. But to demonstrate this, he needs to show what justice actually is, and here he makes his famous move of examining justice in the city before examining it in the individual. A city comes into being, Plato argues, because no individual is self-sufficient. We need each other for food, shelter, protection, and all the necessities of life. In Plato's imagined city, different classes of people emerge naturally based on their different aptitudes. Some are suited to be producers, farmers, craftsmen, traders, who make and exchange goods. Others have the spirit and courage to be guardians, soldiers who protect the city from external enemies, and a select few have the wisdom and temperament to be rulers, philosopher-kings who govern with knowledge rather than opinion. Each class has a specific virtue. The producers need moderation to avoid excess and conflict. The guardians need courage to face danger without cowardice. The rulers need wisdom to make correct decisions. Justice in the city, Plato argues, consists in each class doing its own work and not interfering with the others. Justice is a kind of harmonious arrangement where everyone performs the role they are naturally suited for. Injustice occurs when classes overstep their bounds. When a producer tries to be a guardian, when a guardian tries to rule, or when anyone tries to do multiple jobs instead of specializing in one. This principle of specialization, each person doing what they are naturally suited for, is the essence of social justice. Now Plato makes the crucial analogy to the individual soul. Just as the city has three classes, the soul has three parts. The rational part corresponds to the rulers, the spirited part to the guardians, and the appetitive part to the producers. The rational part seeks truth and wisdom. The spirited part seeks honour and can feel anger or pride. The appetitive part seeks physical pleasures, food, drink, sex, and material goods. Justice in the individual soul, like justice in the city, consists in proper hierarchy and harmony among these parts. A just person is one whose rational part rules, whose spirited part supports reason and controls appetite, and whose appetitive part obeys reason's commands. In such a soul, reason determines what is truly good, spirit provides the motivation and energy to pursue it, and appetite is satisfied in appropriate measure without dominating. This is psychological health, the well-ordered soul. Injustice, by contrast, occurs when appetite rebels against reason, when the spirited part serves appetite instead of reason, or when any part tries to rule that should not. This is psychological disorder, the sick soul. With this account in place, Plato can finally answer why we should be just. Justice is not valuable because it brings external rewards, though it may do so. Justice is valuable because it is the health of the soul, the proper ordering of our psychological faculties. An unjust person, even one with the ring of Gyges who escapes all punishment, has a disordered soul in constant internal conflict. Such a person cannot be happy because happiness requires harmony, and their soul is at war with itself. The tyrant, who appears to have everything, is actually the most miserable person, slave to chaotic desires with reason completely overthrown. This is a brilliant philosophical move that influenced ethics for millennia. Plato grounds morality not in external commands or social conventions, but in human psychology itself. Being just is not about obeying arbitrary rules, but about achieving psychological health. Being unjust is not primarily about harming others, but about harming yourself, about becoming internally disordered and unable to flourish. Morality becomes rational self-interest, properly understood. However, this account of justice faces severe criticisms that have troubled readers since antiquity. The most obvious problem is that Plato's concept of justice seems completely disconnected from ordinary moral intuitions. When we think about justice, we think about treating people fairly, giving them what they deserve, respecting rights, not harming innocents. Plato's justice means something entirely different. It means a harmonious arrangement of psychological parts or social classes. A brutal dictator whose soul parts are in harmony would count as just by Plato's definition, even while committing terrible injustices in the ordinary sense. The political implications are even more troubling. If justice means everyone staying in their assigned place, then Plato's theory justifies rigid social hierarchy and the complete absence of social mobility. You are born into a class and must remain there whether you like it or not. This offends our modern commitment to equality and individual freedom. Worse, it gives philosophical legitimacy to oppression. The producers must accept their subordinate position, not because the rulers force them, but because justice itself requires it. This makes Plato's political philosophy profoundly anti-democratic and potentially totalitarian. The analogy between city and soul has also been devastatingly criticized. Cities are made of individuals, but souls are not made of smaller souls. The relationship between parts of the soul and the whole soul is fundamentally different from the relationship between citizens and the city. What grounds this analogy? Plato never provides a convincing answer. The move seems to be purely rhetorical, taking advantage of superficial similarities to smuggle controversial political conclusions into the analysis of individual psychology. Bernard Williams, a 20th-century philosopher, pointed out a deeper problem. Plato tries to show that justice is valuable independently of its consequences, but his argument works by smuggling consequences back in through the concept of psychic harmony. He argues that the just person is happier because they have internal harmony, but this just makes internal harmony the consequence that makes justice valuable. Plato has not really shown that justice is intrinsically valuable at all, only that it is valuable for producing a different consequence, psychological well-being. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, launched perhaps the most fierce attack on Plato's political philosophy. Popper argued that Plato was fundamentally hostile to the open society, to individual freedom, social mobility, and democratic governance. Plato's ideal state is a totalitarian nightmare where children are separated from parents, lies are told to maintain social control, and dissent is impossible because everyone has been conditioned to accept their role. Popper saw Plato as a founding father of totalitarianism, an enemy of the liberal democratic values that make human flourishing possible. Yet defenders of Plato argue that Popper misread the Republic as a political blueprint when it is really a philosophical thought experiment. Plato was not trying to design an actual state, but to understand justice through an idealized model. The extreme features of his city, the community of women and children, the noble lies, the rigid hierarchy, are not serious proposals but provocative exaggerations meant to force us to think deeply about justice and human nature. Reading the Republic as practical political advice misunderstands its genre and purpose. Moreover, some of Plato's insights about justice remain valuable even if we reject his specific theory. He was right that justice is not just about external behavior, but about internal character. A person who refrains from theft only because they fear punishment is not truly just. Justice requires a certain kind of soul, a disposition to act justly that comes from within. Modern virtue ethics has recovered this Platonic insight that ethics is fundamentally about character, rather than just following rules. Plato also correctly identified that personal morality and political justice are deeply connected. You cannot have a just society made up of unjust people, and it is difficult for people to become just in an unjust society. The institutions we create shape our characters, and our characters determine what institutions we will create and maintain. This feedback loop between personal and political virtue remains a crucial insight for anyone concerned with social justice. The challenge of the immoralist, embodied in Thrasymachus and the Ring of Gyges, remains philosophically urgent. Why should I be moral if I can get away with immorality? Plato's answer, that immorality corrupts the soul regardless of external consequences, has intuitive appeal. We recognize that cruel or selfish people damage themselves morally even when they profit materially. Something is wrong with them as persons, something that no amount of external success can fix. Whether Plato adequately demonstrated this or merely asserted it remains debatable, but he identified a deep truth about human psychology. Contemporary political philosophers continue to wrestle with Plato's fundamental questions. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, tried to derive principles of justice from rational choice, asking what principles we would choose if we did not know our position in society. This is a modern attempt to answer Plato's challenge to show that justice is rational and beneficial, even apart from social enforcement. Like Plato, Rawls connects justice to human psychology and rational self-interest, though his conclusions about what justice requires are radically different. The relationship between individual and collective justice remains contested. Some argue that social justice and individual virtue are separate domains requiring different theories. Others maintain the Platonic view that they are intimately connected, that we cannot understand one without understanding the other. The debate about whether character ethics or political philosophy has priority goes back to Plato's decision to examine the city before examining the soul. Ultimately, Plato's political philosophy represents both a profound achievement and a cautionary tale. He showed that political questions are ultimately about human nature and human flourishing, that we cannot separate ethics from politics or individual from society. But his authoritarian conclusions, his hostility to democracy, his rigid social hierarchy remind us that philosophical brilliance does not guarantee moral wisdom. Plato asked the right questions about justice, but gave answers that, taken literally, would create a nightmare. The challenge for us is to learn from his insights while avoiding his errors, to think as deeply as Plato did about justice while remaining committed to freedom and human dignity. Part 4. The Ideal State and Governance, the Philosopher-King Paradox. Plato believed that almost every existing government was corrupt, dysfunctional, and incapable of making citizens happy. Democracy, which Athenians prided themselves on, was especially dangerous in his eyes. He had seen democracy vote to execute his beloved teacher Socrates, and he believed it was fundamentally irrational, ruled by an ignorant mob swayed by demagogues. But if existing forms of government are failures, what would a good government look like? Plato's answer was radical then, and remains controversial today. Only philosophers should rule. The famous paradox appears in the Republic. Cities will have no rest from evils, Plato declares, until philosophers become kings, or kings become philosophers, until political power and philosophical wisdom meet in the same person. This is not just a preference or suggestion. Plato thought it was a necessary truth, as certain as any mathematical theorem. Good government requires knowledge, specifically knowledge of the forms and especially the form of the good. Without this knowledge, rulers are blind, making decisions based on opinion rather than wisdom, and blind rulers inevitably lead their cities to disaster. But who are these philosophers who should rule? For Plato, philosophers are not just people who study philosophy or love wisdom abstractly. True philosophers have successfully ascended from the cave. They have turned their souls away from the changing physical world and grasped eternal truths through pure reason. They understand the form of the good, which is the source of all value and the foundation of all knowledge. They know what is truly beneficial for human beings, not just what appears beneficial. They have both the knowledge and the moral character to rule wisely and justly. The education of these philosopher rulers takes decades and is incredibly selective. It begins in childhood with music and gymnastics, not to create performers or athletes, but to shape character. Music cultivates the soul, teaching harmony and moderation. Gymnastics cultivates the body, teaching courage and discipline. But these are just preliminary. At 20, the promising students begin studying mathematics, not for practical purposes, but to draw the soul toward abstract truth. They study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and harmonics for 10 years, learning to think about eternal patterns rather than changing particulars. At 30, the survivors are introduced to dialectic, the philosophical method of question and answer that leads to understanding of the forms. For 5 years, they practice dialectic, learning to examine assumptions, identify contradictions, and ascend from hypotheses to first principles. But Plato warns this is dangerous. Young people exposed to dialectic too early often become intellectual anarchists, using argument to undermine all beliefs and justify anything. Only those with stable characters should be taught the most powerful tool of reason. At 35 comes the most shocking requirement. These brilliant philosophers, on the verge of grasping ultimate truth, must descend back into the cave. They must take positions of practical responsibility, serving as military officers and administrators for 15 years. Why this interruption in their education? Because philosophers must understand the real world they will govern. They cannot be pure theorists disconnected from practical affairs. Leadership requires both wisdom and experience, both knowledge of forms and familiarity with particular circumstances. Finally, at 50, those who have excelled in both philosophy and practical affairs are ready to rule. They have completed the ascent to knowledge, they have seen the form of the good, and they have returned with the wisdom and experience to govern well. But here, Plato introduces a twist that has puzzled readers ever since. These philosopher rulers will not want to rule. Having experienced the joy of philosophical contemplation, they will consider governing a burden, a distraction from the higher life of the mind. They must be compelled to rule, not by force, but by their own sense of justice and gratitude to the city that educated them. The guardians, both the philosopher rulers and the auxiliary warriors, live under extraordinary restrictions. They own no private property beyond bare necessities. They have no nuclear families. Children are raised communally and do not know their biological parents. They share meals, housing, and their entire lives are devoted to the city. Plato thought private property and family bonds create conflicts of interest, making rulers serve themselves or their relatives rather than the common good. Only by eliminating private interests can rulers serve the public interest genuinely. Women can be guardians and even philosopher rulers on equal terms with men, a remarkably progressive position for ancient Greece. Plato argued that gender differences are irrelevant to the capacity for wisdom and courage. Just as some female dogs are as good at guarding as male dogs, some women are as suited for philosophy and leadership as men. The only relevant question is natural aptitude, not biological sex. This makes Plato one of the first Western philosophers to argue for gender equality in education and political participation, though within the context of his broader authoritarian system. The city also employs what Plato calls noble lies, myths told to maintain social order. The most famous is the myth of the metals, which tells citizens that God mixed gold into the souls of rulers, silver into guardians, and bronze or iron into producers. This myth is meant to make people accept their social position as natural and divinely ordained. Plato is completely explicit that this is a falsehood, but he thinks it is a necessary one. Without such myths, the lower classes might rebel, and the delicate harmony of the city would collapse. The parallels with modern totalitarianism are impossible to ignore. A ruling elite claiming special knowledge, control of education and information, elimination of the family, rigid class structure, and state-sponsored lies all appear in 20th century totalitarian regimes. The Soviet Union claimed that Communist Party members possessed scientific knowledge of history that justified their monopoly on power. They controlled education, used propaganda, weakened family bonds through communal childcare, and created rigid class distinctions between party members and workers. Did Plato provide the blueprint for totalitarianism? But defenders argue we must understand Plato's historical context. He lived through the disastrous Peloponnesian War, which Athenian democracy lost through a combination of incompetence and demagoguery. He saw leaders chosen for their rhetorical skill rather than wisdom, policies adopted because they pleased the crowd rather than because they were sound, and ultimately the execution of Socrates by democratic vote. In this context, his hostility to democracy and his search for rule by knowledge rather than opinion become more understandable, if not defensible. Moreover, Plato was aware his ideal city is almost impossible to realize. He admits it exists perhaps only in heaven as a pattern for those who want to see it and found a city in their own souls. This suggests the Republic is not a practical political manual, but a philosophical thought experiment. By imagining the perfect city, Plato helps us understand justice and human nature. The value lies in the analysis, not in the blueprint. Yet the philosophical assumptions underlying Plato's politics remain deeply problematic. The core assumption is that politics is like a technical expertise comparable to medicine or navigation. Just as you want a skilled doctor treating your illness, not a democratic vote by people who know nothing about medicine, you should want experts running the state. But this analogy fails. Politics involves value judgments, questions about what kind of society we want, how to balance competing goods, what trade-offs to make. There is no value-neutral expertise that can answer these questions. The problem becomes acute when we ask how non-philosophers can recognize true philosophers. If wisdom is as rare and difficult as Plato claims, how can ordinary citizens judge who possesses it? History is full of people claiming special knowledge or divine right to rule. Without some way for non-experts to evaluate expertise, we have no protection against charlatans and tyrants who merely claim to be philosopher-kings. Plato never adequately solves this recognition problem. Democratic theory offers a different approach, arguing that those affected by decisions should participate in making them. Even if some people are wiser than others, there are good reasons to distribute political power widely. Decision-makers need information about how policies affect people, and those affected have unique access to that information. Power needs checks and balances to prevent abuse, and concentrated power inevitably corrupts. Collective deliberation can produce wisdom even when no individual possesses it, as diverse perspectives interact and moderate each other. The economist Friedrich Hayek articulated this powerfully in his critique of central planning. No individual or committee, however wise, can possess all the dispersed knowledge needed to run an economy or society. Information about local conditions, particular needs, changing circumstances is distributed among millions of people. Market prices and democratic processes aggregate this dispersed knowledge in ways that central planning cannot. Plato's Philosopher-King faces an impossible information problem, even if we grant that some people are wiser than others. Yet Plato identified real problems with democracy that cannot be dismissed. Democratic electorates often choose poorly, preferring leaders who tell them what they want to hear, rather than leaders who tell them the truth. Short-term thinking dominates, long-term planning suffers, and demagogues exploit popular passions. Democratic Athens did execute Socrates. Democratic Germany did elect Hitler. Simply dismissing Plato's critique of democracy is intellectual cowardice. We must confront the weaknesses he identified and design democratic institutions that mitigate them. Modern democracies try to incorporate Platonic insights without accepting his authoritarian conclusions. Constitutional constraints limit what democratic majorities can do, protecting individual rights against the tyranny of majority opinion. Independent judiciaries interpret laws based on expertise and principle rather than popular will. Central banks make monetary policy insulated from democratic pressure. These are all ways of incorporating expertise into democracy without creating philosopher-kings. Educational institutions play a crucial role in this balance. Universities, scientific academies, professional organizations create and validate expertise that can inform democratic decision-making. Ideally, these institutions operate independently of political power while making their knowledge available to policymakers and citizens. This distributed model of expertise differs fundamentally from Plato's concentrated wisdom, but it addresses his core concern that government should be informed by knowledge rather than mere opinion. The question of moral expertise remains particularly vexed. Plato believed philosophers have special insight into moral truth, into what is genuinely good for human beings. But centuries of ethical disagreement among brilliant philosophers suggests there is no clear path to moral knowledge comparable to mathematical or scientific knowledge. Perhaps moral questions are ultimately matters of value judgment where reasonable people can disagree, not technical questions with correct answers that experts can discover. Still, Plato's vision retains a utopian power that continues to inspire. The idea that society could be organized rationally according to principles of justice, that wisdom rather than power or wealth or birth could determine leadership, that government could aim at the common good rather than private advantage remains compelling. Even those who reject Plato's specific proposals often share his fundamental conviction that politics should be guided by reason and directed toward human flourishing. The tragedy of Plato's political philosophy is that his profound diagnosis of political dysfunction led him to a cure that is worse than the disease. He correctly identified that democracies can be irrational, that leaders often lack wisdom, that societies need long-term thinking and moral vision. But his solution, ruled by a philosophical elite with no accountability to those they govern, eliminates the primary safeguard against tyranny. The challenge for us is to address Plato's concerns while preserving democratic values, to find ways to incorporate expertise and wisdom into governance without creating an unaccountable ruling class. This remains one of the central problems of political philosophy, and we are still struggling to solve it. Part 5. Theory of the Soul, the Immortal Self and its Journey. For Plato, understanding the soul was not just an interesting philosophical puzzle, but the key to understanding human life itself. What we truly are is not our body but our soul, and the soul's nature determines how we should live. His theory of the soul connects his metaphysics, epistemology and ethics into a unified vision. But it also leads to some of the most controversial and problematic aspects of his philosophy, claims about immortality and reincarnation that strain credibility. Plato presents multiple arguments for the soul's immortality, arguments he took with profound seriousness. In the Phaedo, which dramatizes Socrates' final hours before execution, he offers 4 distinct proofs. The first is the argument from opposites. Life comes from death and death from life, in an eternal cycle. If souls cease to exist at death, eventually everything would be dead and no new life could arise. Therefore souls must survive death to be reborn into new bodies. The second argument is from recollection, which we encountered earlier. We have knowledge of perfect equality, beauty and goodness that we could not derive from experience, since physical things only approximate these ideals. Therefore we must have acquired this knowledge before birth, which means our souls existed before our bodies. And if souls exist before birth, it is reasonable to think they exist after death as well. The soul is fundamentally independent of the body, attached to it temporarily, but not dependent on it for existence. The third argument claims the soul is simple and incomposite. Things that are composite can be broken down into parts, but the soul has no parts and therefore cannot be destroyed through decomposition. It is more like the eternal unchanging forms than like composite physical bodies. Since it cannot decompose, it must be immortal and indestructible. This connects the soul's immortality directly to Plato's metaphysics. The soul belongs to the realm of eternal being, rather than temporal becoming. The fourth argument is more technical and relies on the theory of forms. The soul is what brings life to the body. Life is essential to the soul's nature, just as heat is essential to fire's nature. But death is the opposite of life. Just as fire cannot admit coldness without ceasing to be fire, the soul cannot admit death without ceasing to be soul. Therefore, the soul must either withdraw when death approaches or be inherently deathless. Either way, it survives bodily death. These arguments may seem unconvincing to modern readers, and indeed they faced criticism even in antiquity. The argument from opposites assumes without justification that there must be a cycle between life and death. The argument from recollection assumes the theory of forms and prenatal existence, both controversial claims. The argument from simplicity assumes the soul has no parts, but Plato himself elsewhere describes the soul as having 3 parts. The argument from essential properties relies on analogies that may not hold. Yet for Plato, these were serious, rational demonstrations, not just wishful thinking about an afterlife. The soul's tripartite structure, introduced in the Republic, creates immediate problems for the immortality doctrine. How can the soul be both simple and uncomposite, as required for immortality, and also have 3 parts, reason, spirit, and appetite? Plato seems to have recognized this tension. In the Phaedo, written earlier, the soul is simple. In the Republic it has parts. In later dialogues like the Timaeus, only the rational part is immortal, while the spirited and appetitive parts perish with the body. Plato may have been revising his views or presenting different theories for different contexts. The tripartite soul explains human psychology in ways that remain influential. We experience internal conflict because different parts of our soul pull us in different directions. Reason tells us to diet, but appetite wants dessert. Reason says to remain calm, but spirit burns with anger. This is not just weakness of will, but actual conflict between semi-independent psychological systems. Modern psychology recognizes similar divisions. Evolutionary psychology's distinction between ancient drives and recent rational capacities, or Freud's ID, ego and superego, though Plato's specific theory is not scientifically valid. Each part of the soul has its own proper pleasure. Appetite finds pleasure in physical satisfaction, food, drink, sex. Spirit finds pleasure in honor, victory, and achievement. Reason finds pleasure in truth, understanding, and wisdom. These pleasures can conflict, and part of living well involves establishing the right hierarchy. The philosopher whose rational part rules experiences intellectual pleasures that, Plato claims, are objectively superior and more satisfying than bodily pleasures. This is not just elitism, but follows from the soul's nature. Reason's pleasures are more stable, more lasting, and more fully satisfying than appetite's pleasures. But perhaps Plato's most striking doctrine is the soul's journey through many lives. In the myth at the end of the Republic, souls choose their next lives after death based on their character in previous lives. A soul that lived philosophically might choose a life of continued contemplation. A soul that lived for honor might choose a warrior's life. A soul corrupted by desire might even choose to become an animal. This is not arbitrary divine judgment, but natural consequence. We become what we love. The tyrant, enslaved to chaotic desires, becomes a tyrannical soul destined for suffering even if he escapes earthly punishment. The myth of air presents this vividly. After death, souls journey to a place of judgment where they see the rewards of the just and punishments of the unjust. Then they gather in a meadow where lots are drawn determining the order in which souls choose their next lives. The first to choose selects a powerful tyranny, not recognizing that this will bring misery. Others choose more wisely, selecting lives that will help them develop virtue. After choosing, souls drink from the river of forgetfulness and are born again with no memory of their previous existence. This doctrine of reincarnation serves multiple philosophical purposes. It explains why people have different natural talents and inclinations. They are consequences of previous lives. It provides ultimate justice. Even if the wicked prosper in this life, they will face consequences in future lives. It explains the feeling of recognizing truths we seem to already know. We learned them in previous lives. And it gives cosmic significance to our choices. They shape not just this life, but countless future lives. Philosophy becomes literally a matter of eternal salvation. Yet from a modern scientific perspective, the entire theory of an immortal soul faces devastating objections. Neuroscience shows that our mental life depends intimately on brain function. Damage to specific brain regions impairs specific cognitive and emotional capacities. Drugs alter consciousness by affecting brain chemistry. Our personalities, memories and abilities are products of neural processes. When the brain dies and these processes cease, there is no reason to think anything survives. The soul appears to be not an independent substance, but an emergent property of physical brain activity. The argument from recollection, crucial for Plato's theory, also fails empirically. We now understand that what Plato took as evidence of prenatal knowledge can be explained by innate cognitive structures shaped by evolution. We recognize equality not because we knew the form of equality before birth, but because our brains evolved pattern recognition capabilities. Mathematical intuitions reflect the structure of neural architecture, not memories of a previous existence among eternal forms. The ethical implications of the soul theory are equally problematic. If our current life is just one of many, death loses its gravity and earthly life its urgency. Why worry about injustice in this life if it will be rectified in future lives? Why care deeply about the suffering of others if it is just temporary and part of a cosmic cycle of reward and punishment? The doctrine of reincarnation can foster passivity and acceptance of evil rather than active efforts to reduce suffering. Moreover, if we have no memory of previous lives, in what sense is it the same soul being reincarnated? Personal identity seems to require psychological continuity, memories, personality, ongoing conscious experience. A soul, completely wiped of memories and reborn with a different body and personality, is not meaningfully the same person. The metaphysical soul persists, but the person does not. This makes the moral significance of reincarnation unclear. Why should I care about punishments or rewards in future lives if I will not remember being the person who deserves them? Yet despite these problems, Plato's soul theory captures something important about human self-understanding. We do experience ourselves as more than just bodies, as subjects of consciousness with an interior life. The fact that this sense of self emerges from physical processes does not make it illusory or unimportant. Plato may be wrong that the soul is an independent substance, but he is right that understanding human psychology requires understanding subjective experience, not just objective physical facts. The tripartite soul, whatever its metaphysical problems, offers genuine psychological insight. We do experience internal conflict between different motivational systems. We do struggle to establish harmony among competing desires and values. The image of the soul as requiring proper ordering, with reason guiding spirit and both controlling appetite, remains a powerful model for self-mastery and psychological health. Modern therapeutic approaches often work towards similar goals, establishing executive control over impulsive desires and aligning emotions with rational judgments. Plato's emphasis on caring for the soul rather than the body influenced Western spirituality profoundly. The idea that our true self is non-physical, that we should value spiritual development over material success, that death is not the end but a transition, these became central to Christian theology. Augustine, one of Christianity's most important thinkers, was deeply influenced by Platonic philosophy. The Christian conception of the immortal soul owes more to Plato than to Hebrew scripture. For better or worse, Plato shaped how billions of people understand themselves and their place in the cosmos. The doctrine that philosophy prepares us for death, central to the Phaedo, also retains significance. Plato argued that the philosopher practices dying by detaching from bodily concerns and focusing on eternal truths. This does not require believing in literal immortality. We can understand it as learning to identify with our rational nature rather than our appetites, to value understanding over pleasure, to care about truth and goodness that transcend our particular existence. Philosophy in this sense teaches us to adopt a perspective beyond our immediate circumstances and mortal concerns. Contemporary philosophers continue to debate whether materialism about the mind is adequate. Some argue that consciousness, subjective experience, cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone. Others defend property dualism, the view that mental properties are distinct from physical properties even if not substances in their own right. While few accept Plato's specific theory of an immortal soul, the questions he raised about the nature of consciousness, personal identity, and the relationship between mind and body remain at the heart of philosophy of mind. Ultimately, Plato's theory of the soul represents a profound but flawed attempt to understand human nature. He correctly recognized that we are more than just biological organisms, that our capacity for rational thought and moral choice distinguishes us fundamentally. But he grounded this recognition in a metaphysical theory, an immortal soul, that we now have strong reasons to reject. The challenge for us is to preserve Plato's insights about human dignity, rationality, and moral responsibility, while accepting that we are mortal, embodied creatures whose minds emerge from physical brains. We must find meaning and value in this life, not because we are immortal souls destined for another existence, but precisely because this is the only life we have. Part 6. Education and the Philosopher-King, Turning the Soul Toward Truth. Plato believed that education is the most important task in any society, yet most societies completely misunderstand what education is. In the Republic, he declares that education is not putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Rather, the soul already has the capacity for knowledge, and education is turning the soul in the right direction, from the world of becoming toward the world of being, from shadows toward reality. This revolutionary conception connects to the theory of recollection. If learning is remembering what the soul already knows, then the teacher's role is not to transmit information, but to draw out understanding. The Socratic dialogues model this approach perfectly. Socrates claims to know nothing and to teach nothing, yet through questioning he leads others to discover truths for themselves. When the slave boy in the Meno discovers geometric truths through Socrates' questioning, he is not receiving new information but recovering knowledge his soul possessed all along. Education must begin in childhood, but not with abstract reasoning. Young children cannot handle dialectic and philosophy. They need their characters shaped first through music and gymnastics. Music, broadly understood to include poetry and stories, cultivates the soul by exposing children to noble examples and harmonious patterns. They should hear stories of virtue rewarded and vice punished, of gods and heroes behaving with justice and courage. These stories shape emotional responses and moral intuitions long before rational understanding develops. But Plato insists on strict censorship of poetry and music. Most existing poetry is harmful because it presents gods behaving immorally and heroes displaying weakness. Homer shows gods lying, fighting among themselves, giving in to lust and anger. The tragic poets show heroes overwhelmed by emotion, wailing in grief, controlled by passion. Exposing children to such models corrupts their souls, teaching them that immorality and emotional excess are normal or even admirable. Therefore, the ideal city must censor literature, permitting only stories that reinforce virtue and self-control. This is one of Plato's most controversial positions, and it reveals the authoritarian core of his educational theory. Who decides what counts as virtuous representation, what stories serve the city's interests, what ideas children should be protected from? The answer is clear. The philosopher-rulers decide, those who know the forms and understand true virtue. Everyone else must accept their judgment. This makes education a tool of social control, shaping children to accept their place in the social hierarchy and never question the system. Gymnastics complements music by training the body and cultivating courage. But the goal is not athletic excellence for its own sake. It is to create a harmonious balance in the soul. Too much music without gymnastics makes people soft and weak. Too much gymnastics without music makes them harsh and brutal. The properly educated guardian is both gentle and fierce, philosophical and courageous, able to think clearly and act bravely. As students mature, they proceed to mathematics, which Plato considered the ideal preparation for philosophy. Mathematics draws the soul away from the physical world toward eternal truths. When you understand that 2 + 2 = 4, you are not learning a fact about physical objects, but grasping an eternal relationship among numbers. Mathematical study trains the mind to think about abstract entities accessible only through reason, preparing it for the ultimate step toward understanding the forms themselves. But mathematics alone is not sufficient. It remains hypothetical. Mathematicians start with assumptions, axioms they accept without proof, and derive consequences. They know their conclusions follow from their premises, but they do not understand why the premises themselves are true. Only dialectic, philosophical reasoning that questions every assumption and seeks first principles can provide this ultimate understanding. Only those who master dialectic can grasp the forms directly and understand why they must be as they are. The image of the divided line and the allegory of the cave illustrate this educational progression. We begin in the cave watching shadows and taking them for reality. The first stage of education, music and gymnastics, improves our character but keeps us focused on images and physical things. Mathematics begins the ascent, turning our attention to abstract patterns. Dialectic completes the journey, bringing us out of the cave entirely to see reality in the light of the sun, the form of the good. But here comes the most shocking requirement. Those who complete the ascent and grasp the forms must return to the cave. They must take up practical responsibilities, serve as soldiers and administrators, deal with the messy particulars of political life. This seems cruel, asking those who have experienced the highest truth to descend back into the world of shadows. Plato acknowledges they will not want to return, they will resent this obligation, but justice requires it. The city educated them, and they owe the city their service. This descent reveals something profound about Platonic education. It is not just about individual enlightenment, but about social responsibility. The purpose of education is not to create detached sages who contemplate truth for their own satisfaction. It is to produce philosopher-rulers who can govern wisely and create conditions where others can flourish. Education is ultimately in service to the city, to the collective good, not to individual self-actualization. The educational program also embodies Plato's conviction that ability should determine opportunity, not birth or wealth. Children of all classes are tested, and those who show promise are educated further regardless of their parents' status. Gold souls may be born to bronze parents, and bronze souls to gold parents. The city must identify ability wherever it appears and cultivate it. This meritocratic element of Plato's system is admirable, though it operates within an otherwise rigid hierarchy. Yet the entire system rests on deeply problematic assumptions. First, Plato assumes that some people are naturally suited to rule, while others are naturally suited to be ruled, that these differences are innate and identifiable through education. This is not just about different talents. Everyone has different talents, but about fundamentally different types of souls. The philosophical temperament is rare and precious. Most people are incapable of it. This aristocratic assumption is offensive to democratic and egalitarian sensibilities. Second, the system assumes that those who complete philosophical education will rule wisely and justly. But knowledge of abstract forms does not guarantee practical wisdom or moral virtue. History provides countless examples of brilliant intellectuals who supported tyranny or committed terrible acts. The 20th century saw numerous philosophers and scientists who embraced totalitarian ideologies. Abstract reasoning ability does not make someone fit to rule, and may even make them dangerous if combined with ambition and lack of empathy. Third, the system requires those being educated to accept their teacher's judgment about their capacity and proper role. If you're told you have a bronze soul and should be a farmer, you must accept this judgment. But what if the judgment is wrong? What if the tests miss your potential? What if those doing the sorting have biases or ulterior motives? The system provides no mechanism for appeal or revision, no way for individuals to prove the judgment wrong. This eliminates human agency and self-determination in the name of social harmony. The censorship of poetry reveals another troubling aspect. Plato wants to protect people from false and corrupting ideas, but who determines what is false and corrupting? The philosopher-rulers, of course, who alone know the truth. But this creates a closed system where those in power control education, education shapes beliefs, and beliefs determine who gains power. There is no external check, no way for new ideas to challenge established orthodoxy. This is a recipe for intellectual stagnation and ideological ossification. Modern liberal education takes a fundamentally different approach. Instead of turning students toward predetermined truths, it exposes them to diverse perspectives and teaches them to think critically. Instead of censoring dangerous ideas, it trusts students to evaluate ideas for themselves. Instead of sorting people into fixed roles, it tries to develop each person's potential in multiple directions. The goal is autonomous individuals capable of making their own decisions, not harmonious citizens who accept their assigned place. Yet Plato's emphasis on character education, not just intellectual training, remains valuable. Modern education often focuses narrowly on skills and knowledge, ignoring ethical development. Plato reminds us that education should shape the whole person, cultivating virtues like courage, moderation, and justice alongside intellectual abilities. A purely technical education that produces skillful but unprincipled people serves neither individuals nor society well. The idea that education should be free and available based on merit rather than wealth remains influential. Most modern democracies at least aspire to provide equal educational opportunity to all children, regardless of family background. The goal is to identify and cultivate talent wherever it exists, not to perpetuate privilege across generations. This Platonic ideal, however imperfectly realized, has become a foundational principle of democratic societies. The Socratic method of teaching through questioning has proven remarkably durable. Law schools use the Socratic method to develop analytical skills. Philosophy classes use it to deepen understanding, and good teachers everywhere use questions to draw out student thinking rather than simply lecturing. The insight that genuine understanding must be constructed by the learner, not passively received from a teacher, represents one of Plato's most important contributions to educational theory. Contemporary debates about education often replay Platonic themes. Should education aim to produce workers who fit into existing social structures or critical thinkers who can transform society? Should it transmit cultural traditions or challenge them? Should it sort students by ability or try to develop everyone's potential? Should it focus on abstract knowledge or practical skills? These are all versions of tensions inherent in Plato's educational philosophy. The digital age has created new educational challenges that Plato's theory illuminates. With unlimited information available online, the traditional teacher's role as information provider has diminished. But the need for guidance in turning toward truth rather than illusion has intensified. Social media algorithms create personalized caves where people see only shadows that confirm their existing beliefs. Education must help students escape these digital caves, learn to evaluate sources, distinguish truth from manipulation, and think independently. Plato's greatest insight about education may be that it is fundamentally about transformation, not just information. True education changes who we are, how we see the world, what we value. It turns the soul in a new direction, as Plato says, from darkness toward light, from becoming toward being, from opinion toward knowledge. Whether or not we accept his metaphysics, this vision of education as transformative remains powerful. Education should not just fill minds with facts but open them to new possibilities, not just train workers but cultivate human potential. The tragedy is that Plato combined this profound insight with an authoritarian system that would crush individuality and eliminate freedom. The challenge for us is to preserve the best of Platonic education, the focus on character, the use of questioning, the goal of turning students toward truth while rejecting its totalitarian elements. We must find ways to educate for virtue without imposing a single vision of the good life, to cultivate critical thinking without nihilism, to develop the whole person while respecting individual autonomy. This remains one of the great unsolved problems in educational philosophy, and we are still learning from Plato's example, both his successes and his failures. Part 7. Ethics and Virtue, the Unity of the Good Life. For Plato, ethics was not about following rules or calculating consequences, but about becoming a certain kind of person. The central question was not what should I do, but how should I live, what kind of soul should I cultivate, what makes a human life worth living. His answer was radical in its intellectualism: virtue is knowledge, and all wrongdoing stems from ignorance. This claim, inherited from Socrates, became one of the most controversial doctrines in Western ethics. The paradox appears immediately. We all know people who know perfectly well what is right, but do the wrong thing anyway. The person on a diet who knows they should not eat dessert, but does. The student who knows they should study, but watches television instead. The cheater who knows betrayal is wrong, but does it regardless. How can Plato claim that virtue is knowledge and vice is ignorance when experience shows that people act against their knowledge constantly? Plato's response is that these people do not really know what is good for them. They may have a verbal formula, they can recite that health is good or honesty is valuable, but they lack genuine understanding. Real knowledge of the good transforms the soul. If you truly understood, not just intellectually but with your whole being, that virtue leads to happiness and vice to misery, you could not choose vice. The problem is not that knowledge fails to motivate, but that what we call knowledge is often just opinion or belief, lacking the compelling force of genuine understanding. This leads to another controversial claim, the unity of virtue. According to Plato, you cannot have one virtue without having them all. Justice, courage, moderation, wisdom, these are not separate qualities you could possess individually. They are aspects of a single harmonious condition of the soul. A truly just person must be courageous because standing up for justice requires courage. They must be moderate because excess and immoderation lead to injustice. They must be wise because without wisdom you cannot identify what justice requires in particular situations. The unity of virtue follows from the theory that virtue is knowledge. If all virtues are really just knowledge of good and evil, then they must be united. The courageous person knows what is truly worth fearing, which is only genuine evil. The temperate person knows what is truly worth desiring, which is only genuine good. The just person knows what is truly worth pursuing, which is the harmony of the soul. These all require the same knowledge, so they must be the same virtue viewed from different angles. Each virtue corresponds to the proper functioning of a part of the soul. Wisdom belongs to the rational part, which should rule. Courage belongs to the spirited part, which should support reason and control appetite. Moderation belongs to the appetitive part, which should obey reason's commands. Justice is the harmonious arrangement of all three parts, each doing its proper work without interfering with the others. A virtuous person is one whose soul parts are properly ordered, with reason ruling, spirit supporting, and appetite obeying. But how do we acquire this knowledge that constitutes virtue? Here Plato combines his theory of recollection with the practice of dialectic. We must engage in philosophical dialogue, asking and answering questions, examining our assumptions, following arguments wherever they lead. Through this process, we recover knowledge the soul possessed before birth but forgot in the trauma of embodiment. The philosopher is like a midwife, helping others give birth to understanding they already possess. The forms provide objective standards for ethical judgment. When we ask whether an action is just, we are really asking whether it conforms to or participates in the form of justice itself. When we ask whether a life is good, we are asking whether it reflects the form of goodness. Ethics is not subjective or relative because the forms exist independently of human opinion. We can be objectively wrong about what is good, just as we can be objectively wrong about mathematics because there is a standard independent of what we believe. The form of the good holds a special place in Plato's ethics. It is the highest form, the source of all other forms, analogous to the sun which makes everything else visible. Understanding the good is the pinnacle of philosophical achievement. Only those who grasp the form of the good can truly understand what is valuable and how to live well. This is why only philosophers should rule. Only they have the knowledge necessary to identify genuine human flourishing and create social conditions that promote it. But what exactly is the form of the good? Plato is maddeningly vague about this, suggesting that the good is beyond being, that it cannot be directly described but only approached through analogies. Some scholars think the good is moral perfection. Others think it is a metaphysical principle of unity and order. Others think it is self-sufficient fulfillment. This vagueness has frustrated readers for centuries. How can ethical life depend on grasping the good if we cannot clearly say what the good is? Plato also introduces the famous Euthyphro dilemma, though in a different context. Is something good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is good? The question reveals a deep problem for divine command theories of ethics. If things are good because gods command them, then goodness is arbitrary, depending on divine whim. But if gods command things because they are good, then goodness is independent of the gods, and we need a different explanation for what makes things good. Plato clearly accepts the second horn. Goodness is independent and objective. Even the gods must recognize it. The connection between virtue and happiness is central to Plato's ethics. He argues that virtue is necessary and sufficient for happiness, that the virtuous person is happy regardless of external circumstances. Even a just person on the rack suffering torture is happier than an unjust person enjoying wealth and power. This seems wildly implausible, but Plato insists. Happiness consists in the harmony of the soul, and the virtuous person has this harmony while the vicious person does not. External goods contribute nothing essential to happiness, which is entirely internal. This raises the problem of moral luck. If virtue is sufficient for happiness, then accidents of birth, fortune, and circumstance cannot really affect our well-being. But this seems to deny obvious truths. A person born into slavery, no matter how virtuous, has a worse life than a free person. A person who suffers terrible disease or loses loved ones to violence has grounds for unhappiness regardless of their virtue. Aristotle would later argue contra Plato that external goods are necessary for complete happiness, that virtue alone is not sufficient. The intellectualism of Plato's ethics has been a constant target of criticism. Aristotle objected that virtue requires not just knowledge, but proper training of emotions and desires. You could know what is right, and still lack the emotional dispositions to act rightly. Virtue requires habituation, repeated practice that shapes character over time, not just intellectual insight. Practical wisdom involves knowing how to act in particular situations, a kind of knowledge that is not reducible to theoretical understanding of forms. The unity of virtue doctrine also faces problems. We recognize people who are courageous but not particularly just, or temperate but not especially wise. Virtues seem to come apart in actual human beings. A person might have the courage to face physical danger while lacking the moral courage to admit mistakes. They might control bodily appetites through discipline while being immoderate in their ambition for honor. Plato's insistence that genuine virtue requires all virtues seems like a theoretical construction that does not match moral reality. The claim that no one does wrong willingly has been called the Socratic paradox. If all wrongdoing stems from ignorance, then criminals and villains are not truly responsible for their actions, they simply do not know better. But this seems to eliminate moral responsibility and justify every crime as just a mistake. Plato's response would be that moral ignorance is still blameworthy. We are responsible for failing to seek knowledge and examine our lives. But this response seems inadequate. Some people actively choose to remain ignorant, to avoid examining whether their actions are just, and this seems like a moral failure distinct from simple ignorance. Yet Plato's ethics contains insights that remain valuable. The emphasis on character rather than just action represents an important truth. Ethics is not just about what you do, but about who you are, the virtues and vices that constitute your character. Two people might perform the same action for different reasons, one from genuine virtue and another from fear of punishment, and there is a moral difference between them. Virtue ethics, which focuses on character development rather than rules or consequences, continues this Platonic tradition. The idea that ethics requires understanding, not just compliance, also remains important. Someone who acts rightly because they are told to is less morally developed than someone who acts rightly because they understand why it is right. Moral education should aim at understanding, at helping people grasp the reasons behind ethical principles, not just teaching them to follow rules blindly. The Socratic method of moral inquiry, asking why we should act one way rather than another, represents a valuable educational approach. Plato's conviction that ethics is not arbitrary or conventional but grounded in objective reality has been enormously influential. If there are objective moral truths, like mathematical truths, then moral progress is possible, and moral disagreement is not just a clash of preferences. We can meaningfully say that slavery is wrong, not just that we disapprove of it because it violates objective principles of justice. This moral realism, the view that ethical truths exist independently of our beliefs, continues to attract philosophers who want to defend objective morality. The connection between ethics and well-being also remains philosophically important. Most people accept that morality and self-interest are separate, even opposed, that we must sometimes sacrifice our own good for moral duty. But Plato challenges this, arguing that virtue is in our self-interest properly understood. Being just makes us happy, being unjust makes us miserable, regardless of external rewards and punishments. If this is true, if ethics and prudence ultimately coincide, then morality rests on a firmer foundation than if it requires self-sacrifice. Contemporary virtue ethics developed by philosophers like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse draws heavily on Plato and Aristotle. It focuses on character development, on cultivating virtues that enable human flourishing, rather than on following rules or maximizing utility. While modern virtue ethicists reject Plato's metaphysics and his strict intellectualism, they accept his basic framework that ethics is about becoming a certain kind of person and living a certain kind of life. The challenge for Platonic ethics today is to preserve its insights while correcting its errors. We should maintain that ethics involves understanding, not just rule-following, that character matters more than isolated actions, that there are objective truths about how humans should live. But we must reject the idea that virtue is simply knowledge, that external circumstances do not matter for happiness, that all virtues are unified. We need a more sophisticated moral psychology that recognizes how reason, emotion, habit and situation all contribute to ethical life. Perhaps Plato's greatest contribution to ethics was raising the stakes. He insisted that nothing matters more than living well, that wealth, pleasure, reputation, even life itself have value only in relation to virtue and the harmony of the soul. In a culture that often treats ethics as an afterthought, as something to consider only when convenient, Plato reminds us that ethical questions are the most important questions we face. How should I live? What kind of person should I become? What makes a human life worth living? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles, but the urgent practical questions that determine whether our lives succeed or fail. Part 8. The Allegory of the Cave, Enlightenment and Return. The Allegory of the Cave is perhaps Plato's most famous and powerful image, a story that has haunted Western imagination for over 2 millennia. It appears in Book 7 of the Republic as Socrates tries to explain the nature of education and enlightenment. The allegory works on multiple levels simultaneously, as an epistemology showing the stages of knowledge, as a metaphysics depicting levels of reality, as a political theory about who should rule, and as an existential drama about the human condition itself. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood, able to look only forward at the cave wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway where people carry objects, casting shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only these shadows and hear only echoes, never the real objects or genuine sounds. Having known nothing else their entire lives, they believe the shadows are reality itself. They become experts at predicting which shadow will appear next. They compete for honor in their skill at this game. They think they understand their world completely. Now imagine one prisoner is freed and forced to turn around toward the fire. At first the light hurts their eyes, they resist. They want to turn back to the familiar shadows. The real objects casting shadows seem less real than the shadows themselves, because the prisoner has spent a lifetime learning to see shadows clearly, but has never learned to see actual objects. Only gradually, with painful adjustment, can they recognize that the objects are more real than their shadows. Next, the prisoner is dragged up the steep, rough path out of the cave into the sunlight. The pain and confusion intensify. Sunlight is so bright, the prisoner cannot see anything at all at first. They long to return to the cave, where at least they knew what they were seeing. Only slowly can they begin to see reflections in water, then shadows of real objects, then the objects themselves. Then finally perhaps they can look at the sun itself and understand that it is the source of everything they see. This freed prisoner has made a complete epistemological journey. From the lowest level of cognition, mistaking images for reality, through correct belief about physical objects, to mathematical reasoning about abstract patterns, and finally to philosophical understanding of the forms themselves, culminating in knowledge of the good. Each stage requires a painful reorientation, giving up comfortable falsehoods for uncomfortable truths. Education is not adding information, but a conversion of the whole soul from darkness to light. But the allegory continues with a disturbing twist. Suppose the enlightened prisoner, out of compassion or duty, returns to the cave to free the others. Their eyes, adapted to sunlight, cannot see in the darkness. The prisoners, watching them stumble and fail at the shadow prediction game, conclude that the journey upward destroys sight rather than improving it. When the freed prisoner tries to explain that the shadows are not real, that there is a whole world above, the prisoners think they have gone mad. If the freed prisoner persists in trying to unchain the others and drag them toward the light, the prisoners will resist with violence. They will kill anyone who tries to free them, Plato says, because they prefer comfortable illusion to painful truth. Here Plato is clearly thinking of Socrates, who tried to enlighten Athens and was executed for his trouble. The allegory becomes a tragedy, showing why philosophers are unwelcome in ordinary society and why enlightenment often leads to persecution rather than gratitude. The cave represents our ordinary condition. We are all born into the cave of conventional belief, accepting without question the opinions of our culture, the values of our society, the limited perspective of our immediate experience. We think we know reality when we know only appearances. We think we understand when we merely have comfortable opinions. We think we see when we are still almost blind. The rare person who questions these beliefs, who seeks genuine understanding, must undergo a difficult and painful journey. The fire in the cave represents the material sun, source of physical light that makes physical objects visible. But this is inferior to the real sun outside the cave, which represents the form of the good, source of all truth and reality. Just as the sun makes physical seeing possible, the good makes intellectual understanding possible. Without the good we could not know any truth, just as without the sun we could not see any physical object. The good is the ultimate principle that gives reality and intelligibility to everything else. The shadows on the cave wall represent images and appearances, the lowest level of reality. The objects carried along the walkway represent physical things in the sensible world. The world outside the cave represents the intelligible realm of forms. The sun represents the form of the good. Each level is more real than the one below, and each requires a different cognitive faculty to apprehend it. The journey from cave to sunlight is the philosophical progression from ignorance to knowledge. But the allegory also contains a political message about enlightenment and power. Those who have made the journey outside the cave and seen reality are the only ones fit to rule. They understand what is genuinely good for human beings, not just what appears good. They can organize society according to true principles of justice rather than popular opinion. But these enlightened philosopher rulers will not want to rule. They will prefer the contemplation of truth to the messy business of governing. They must be compelled to return to the cave and rule, not for their own sake, but for the sake of justice and the common good. The allegory has troubling implications for Plato's politics. It suggests that ordinary people cannot recognize truth, that they will reject and even kill those who try to enlighten them, that they must be ruled by an elite who know better. This is profoundly anti-democratic. It says that popular opinion is worthless, that the masses live in illusion, that they cannot be trusted with power over their own lives. The only hope is that philosophers will take control and impose the truth by force if necessary. This is the intellectual foundation of authoritarianism, yet the allegory also captures something true about the difficulty of changing beliefs and perspectives. We all resist information that challenges our worldview. We cling to comfortable opinions. Even when faced with contrary evidence, we often prefer familiar falsehoods to unfamiliar truths. Cognitive psychology confirms that people experience genuine psychological pain when their fundamental beliefs are challenged, similar to physical pain. The cave allegory's insight that learning requires painful cognitive restructuring remains valid. The image of the return to the cave is philosophically rich. Why should the enlightened person return to help others? Why not remain in the sunlight enjoying the vision of truth? Plato gives two answers. First, justice requires it. The city educated the philosopher, and therefore the philosopher owes service to the city. Second, the philosopher cannot be fully happy while knowing others remain in chains. True philosophical understanding includes recognizing our interdependence with others and our obligation to help them flourish. This creates a paradox about philosophical life. The best life involves contemplating eternal truths, freed from the distractions and illusions of the physical world. But living this best life requires returning to the world of change and confusion, taking on practical responsibilities, engaging with those who do not understand. The philosopher must abandon the activity that constitutes human excellence in order to fulfill the duties that human excellence imposes. The cave allegory reveals this tension at the heart of Platonic ethics. The allegory has been interpreted and reinterpreted across centuries. Early Christians read it as depicting the soul's journey from sin to salvation, from the darkness of worldly life to the light of divine truth. Enlightenment thinkers saw it as representing the progress from superstition to reason, from medieval ignorance to modern science. Marxists interpreted it as describing how ideology keeps workers enchained while revolutionary consciousness frees them. Each age finds in the cave a reflection of its own concerns about knowledge, power and liberation. Existentialist philosophers gave the allegory a darker reading. Perhaps we are always in some cave, our liberation just reveals another set of shadows and there is no final exit to absolute truth. Perhaps the journey out of the cave is not from falsehood to truth, but merely from one perspective to another, each with its own limitations. This skeptical interpretation challenges Plato's confidence that philosophical enlightenment reveals objective reality, rather than just a different, possibly more sophisticated form of illusion. Contemporary cognitive science suggests the cave allegory captures real features of human cognition. We construct our reality from limited sensory input, interpreting ambiguous data according to learned patterns and expectations. We literally see what we expect to see, our brains predicting sensory input and only noticing deviations. In this sense, we are all prisoners interpreting shadows, constructing reality from imperfect information. The possibility of escaping to see things as they really are remains questionable. The digital age has given the allegory new relevance. Social media algorithms create personalized information bubbles, showing each person content that confirms their existing beliefs. People live in separate caves, seeing different shadows, convinced their cave is reality. Breaking free requires deliberate effort to seek out challenging information, to expose oneself to different perspectives, to recognize that comfortable confirmation of our opinions is likely a sign we are still watching shadows. The allegory also speaks to educational philosophy. Should education comfort students by confirming what they already believe, or should it disturb them by challenging their assumptions? Plato clearly chooses disturbance. Real education is painful because it requires giving up comfortable illusions. A teacher who merely tells students what they want to hear leaves them chained in the cave. A good teacher drags students toward the light even when they resist, even when they hate the teacher for it. This justifies educational approaches that provoke and challenge rather than merely transmit information. But the allegory's elitism remains troubling. It divides humanity into those who can see truth and those who cannot, those who should rule and those who should obey, the enlightened and the ignorant. Even if we accept that people have different levels of insight and understanding, the sharp division between philosophers who see reality and others who see only shadows seems implausible. Insight comes in degrees. Experts in one domain are novices in others, and wisdom about human affairs may not correlate with philosophical sophistication. The question of who decides who has left the cave remains unanswerable. If I claim to have ascended to truth while you remain in illusion, how can we resolve our disagreement? You might say the same about me. Without neutral ground for adjudication, we are stuck in a standoff where each side accuses the other of being cave-bound. The allegory provides no way to break this impasse. It simply asserts that philosophers know and others do not, an assertion that non-philosophers have no reason to accept. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the cave allegory is about humility in the face of our epistemic limitations. If we are all prisoners interpreting shadows, then certainty about having grasped ultimate truth should be rare and cautiously claimed. Even those who have made significant cognitive progress toward truth should recognize how far they remain from complete understanding. The allegory suggests that the journey from ignorance to knowledge is long and difficult, with many stages and frequent backslidings. The image of returning to the cave also highlights the ethical dimension of knowledge. Knowledge is not just for personal benefit, but carries responsibility to help others. Those who understand have an obligation to teach, to guide, to free others from illusion. But this must be done with patience and respect, recognizing that others have their own journeys to make and cannot be forced into enlightenment. The returning prisoner who tries to unchain others by force becomes a tyrant, however benevolent their intentions. Ultimately, the allegory of the cave endures because it captures something essential about the human condition. We are finite beings grasping for infinite truth, limited creatures reaching for unlimited understanding. We construct our realities from fragmentary information and then mistake our constructions for reality itself. Breaking free from this condition requires courage, persistence, and help from others who have made parts of the journey. Whether complete escape is possible, whether there is a final exit to absolute truth, remains the ultimate question that the allegory poses but cannot answer. We are left with the image of prisoners in a cave, some claiming to have seen the light, others doubting such light exists, all trying to make sense of the shadows we see and the truths we seek. Part 9. Love, Beauty and the Symposium, the Ladder of Ascent. Plato's theory of love is one of his most psychologically penetrating and personally revealing doctrines. In the Symposium, a dialogue set at a drinking party where guests give speeches praising love, Plato presents love not as mere desire or romance, but as a cosmic force driving us toward the ultimate reality. Through the character of Socrates recounting the teachings of a priestess named Diotima, Plato transforms erotic desire into philosophical yearning, sexual attraction into metaphysical aspiration, and physical beauty into a ladder reaching toward eternal truth. The symposium begins with various speakers offering conventional accounts of love. Phaedrus praises love as inspiring courage. Pausanias distinguishes noble love from vulgar lust. Eryximachus sees love as a universal principle of harmony in nature. But these speeches, while interesting, remain trapped in ordinary understanding. Then comes Aristophanes with his famous myth. Originally, humans were spherical creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. Zeus split them in half as punishment for their pride. And ever since we have wandered the earth seeking our other half, our missing piece. Love is the desire to be reunited with our original wholeness. This myth captures something true about the experience of love, the feeling that another person completes us, that we were incomplete before meeting them. But Plato, through Socrates, will show that this is still a confused understanding. We are not seeking another person to complete us, but seeking something within ourselves that we have lost, and that something is not a physical other half, but knowledge of eternal beauty and goodness. Diotima teaches Socrates that love is neither beautiful nor ugly, neither good nor bad, but in between. Love is wanting, desiring, lacking, and you only want what you do not have. Therefore love cannot be a god, because gods possess all good things and lack nothing. Love is a daemon, an intermediate spirit that connects the human and divine realms. Love is the child of poverty and resourcefulness, always seeking what it lacks, but clever in pursuing it. This makes love fundamentally philosophical. Philosophy literally means love of wisdom, and the philosopher is one who lacks wisdom but desires it and resourcefully pursues it. The object of love, Diotima explains, is not beauty itself, but possession of beauty, and more deeply, possession of the good forever. We want beautiful and good things because we believe possessing them will make us happy. But happiness requires not just possessing good things, but possessing them permanently, forever. This is why all love ultimately aims at immortality. We want to possess the good not just temporarily, but eternally, and since we are mortal, we seek immortality through procreation, creating new beings that carry forward our existence. Now comes the famous ladder of love, Diotima's teaching about how erotic desire can be transformed into philosophical understanding. The journey begins with physical attraction to one beautiful body. The young lover is captivated by the beauty of a particular person, desires them, wants to possess them. But with guidance, the lover realizes that physical beauty is not unique to one person. The same beauty that appears in this body appears in other bodies as well. The lover comes to love all beautiful bodies, recognizing that beauty is something beyond any particular instance. The next step is recognizing that beauty of soul is more valuable than beauty of body. A person with a noble character possesses something more worth loving than mere physical attractiveness. The lover begins to appreciate moral beauty, the beauty of just actions, courageous deeds, wise thoughts. This represents progress because moral beauty is less transient than physical beauty, which fades with age and perishes with the body. But the ascent continues. The lover then discovers beauty in laws, institutions, and practices. Certain social arrangements are beautiful, certain forms of government are noble, certain customs display harmony and order. This beauty is more stable than individual moral beauty because institutions can endure across generations. The lover begins to care about creating beautiful social arrangements, about reforming laws to make them more just, about establishing institutions that embody virtue. This is still love, but transformed into political philosophy and social reform. From social institutions, the ascent leads to the beauty of knowledge itself. Different sciences and areas of understanding possess their own beauty. Mathematics is beautiful in its clarity and necessity. Natural science is beautiful in revealing the order of the cosmos. Philosophical knowledge is beautiful in grasping eternal truths. The lover becomes devoted to learning, to understanding, to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. But even this is not the final stage. At the summit of the ladder, the lover experiences something extraordinary, a sudden vision of beauty itself, the form of beauty. This is not beauty in any particular thing, but beauty as such, eternal, unchanging, perfect. It is not beautiful in one respect and ugly in another, beautiful at one time and ugly at another, beautiful to some people and ugly to others. It is simply, absolutely, eternally beautiful. This vision comes like a revelation, Plato says, suddenly and unexpectedly to those who have properly made the ascent. It is the goal of all longing, the satisfaction of all desire, the truth that was driving the lover forward from the beginning. This experience of beauty itself gives birth to true virtue. Until now, the lover has been pursuing images and reflections of beauty, creating physical children or beautiful speeches or noble institutions, all of which are imperfect and temporary. But one who grasps beauty itself can create true virtue, can bring forth wisdom and justice that participate directly in eternal forms rather than being mere copies. This person achieves a kind of immortality through their soul's contact with eternal reality, becoming dear to the gods and immortal as far as any human can be. The ladder of love reveals the continuity Plato sees between erotic desire and philosophical understanding. The force that drives sexual attraction and romantic love is fundamentally the same force that drives philosophical inquiry. Both are responses to beauty, both involve desire and lack, both seek possession and immortality. The difference is that sexual love fixates on a particular beautiful body, while philosophical love ascends to beauty itself. But they share the same root, the same longing for the good, the same drive toward immortality through union with something greater than ourselves. This theory has been enormously influential in Western culture. The concept of Platonic love, love that transcends physical desire and aims at something higher, entered common vocabulary. The idea that romantic love can be a path to spiritual enlightenment influenced medieval courtly love traditions, Renaissance poetry, romantic literature, and continues to shape how we think about love's meaning. The notion that beauty is a manifestation of ultimate reality, that aesthetic experience can reveal truth, has been central to Western aesthetics, but the theory faces serious criticisms, both philosophical and moral. First, it seems to devalue individual persons in favour of abstract universals. If the proper object of love is beauty itself, then particular beautiful people are just stepping stones to be used and discarded on the path to higher truth. The person you love is not valuable in their own right, but only as an instance of beauty, replaceable by any other instance. This makes love instrumental rather than valuing the beloved for who they uniquely are. It is a remarkably cold and impersonal vision of what should be the most personal and intimate of human connections. Martha Nussbaum, a contemporary philosopher, has argued that the ladder of love represents a kind of transcendence that diminishes rather than enriches human life. By constantly moving beyond particular attachments to universal truths, we lose what is most valuable in love, the irreplaceable individuality of the beloved. Love is not about recognizing that this person instantiates universal beauty, but about caring for this particular person, with all their quirks and imperfections. Plato's ladder asks us to leave behind what matters most in ascending to what matters least. The subordination of physical to spiritual love also has troubling implications. It suggests that bodily desire is inferior, that sexual attraction is merely a confused longing for abstract forms, that physical intimacy has value only as a means to philosophical insight. This body-denying aspect of Platonism influenced Christian sexual ethics in problematic ways, creating guilt and shame around physical desire, treating the body as something to be transcended rather than celebrated. A healthier view would recognize that physical love has its own intrinsic value, not just as a stepping stone to something supposedly higher. The gender politics of the Symposium are also troubling. The ladder of love is taught by Diotima, a woman, but women are otherwise absent from the dialogue, which depicts aristocratic men discussing love while female entertainers are dismissed. Moreover, the love primarily discussed is pederastic love between older men and young boys, a conventional practice in ancient Athens that we now recognize as deeply problematic. Plato's theory of love emerges from and arguably perpetuates social arrangements that exploited vulnerable young people. Yet there is something psychologically acute in Plato's analysis of desire. He recognizes that sexual attraction often masks deeper longings, that we project onto beloved persons qualities and meanings they may not possess, that romantic love can be a kind of confused metaphysics. Modern psychoanalysis has explored similar themes, how desire for another person can represent desire for something within ourselves, how falling in love involves recognizing in another what we lack in ourselves, how the beloved becomes a screen for our own projections and ideals. The idea that love drives us towards self-transcendence also captures something important. Love does take us beyond narrow self-interest, does make us care about something beyond our own pleasure and survival, does open us to larger realities. Whether this should culminate in contemplation of abstract forms is questionable, but the basic insight that love is expansive, that it enlarges the self by connecting us to others and to values beyond ourselves, remains valuable. Love is not just about possessing another person, but about participating in something greater. The connection between beauty and truth in Plato's theory raises deep questions. Is beauty really a path to knowledge, or is this a confusion of aesthetic and epistemic values? Some experiences of beauty do seem to reveal truth. Mathematical proofs can be beautiful in ways that illuminate their correctness. Elegant scientific theories often prove true. But beauty can also deceive, beautiful lies are especially dangerous, and attractive falsehoods can be more appealing than harsh truths. The relationship between aesthetic and epistemic value is more complex than Plato's ladder suggests. Contemporary philosophers of love debate whether love is rational or emotional, whether it requires reasons or transcends them. Plato sides firmly with rationality. Love is really about recognizing value, and it should be directed toward what is genuinely valuable rather than determined by irrational passion. But many argue that love necessarily involves an emotional commitment that goes beyond recognition of value. We do not love people simply because they are valuable. We find them valuable because we love them. Love creates value rather than merely responding to pre-existing value. The question of whether love can be education, as Plato suggests, remains philosophically rich. Can we learn to love better, to direct our desires toward more appropriate objects, to transform physical attraction into spiritual connection? Or is love fundamentally non-rational, resistant to education and improvement, something that happens to us rather than something we can cultivate? Plato's confidence that love can be educated through philosophy seems optimistic, but perhaps not entirely wrong. We can learn to recognize destructive patterns, to distinguish infatuation from mature love, to value in others what truly contributes to human flourishing. The Symposium also contains Alcibiades' speech, which dramatically complicates the dialogue. Alcibiades crashes the party drunk and delivers a speech praising Socrates rather than love in general. He describes his frustrated attempts to seduce Socrates, his confusion at Socrates' indifference to physical beauty, his recognition that Socrates' soul contains extraordinary beauty and wisdom. But Alcibiades has not been transformed by knowing Socrates. He remains driven by ambition and desire. He will eventually betray Athens in disastrous ways. This suggests limits to love's educational power. Not everyone can be led up the ladder, even by the wisest teacher. The relationship between love and mortality is perhaps Plato's deepest insight. We love ultimately because we are mortal and we know it. If we were immortal gods, completely self-sufficient and eternal, we would not love because we would not lack anything. Love is the peculiarly human response to our finitude, our attempt to grasp eternity within time, to possess the good forever despite our temporary existence. This is why love and death are so intimately connected in human experience, why love feels like both the answer to and the source of our deepest vulnerability. Whether the ladder of love points toward genuine transcendence or represents a flight from embodied existence remains debatable. Plato wants us to move from loving bodies to loving souls to loving beauty itself, from the particular to the universal, from the temporal to the eternal. But perhaps genuine wisdom lies not in transcending the particular for the universal, but in finding the universal within the particular, not in leaving behind embodied love for abstract contemplation, but in recognizing that physical love can itself be meaningful and valuable. Perhaps the goal should be not to climb out of our humanity, but to live it more fully and consciously. Ultimately, Plato's theory of love reveals both his genius and his limitations. He saw with extraordinary depth that erotic desire and intellectual aspiration are connected, that beauty draws us toward truth, that love is fundamentally about seeking the good. But his subordination of particular persons to universal forms, his devaluation of physical intimacy, his vision of love as ultimately about solitary contemplation rather than connection with others, these reveal the costs of his philosophical commitments. The challenge is to preserve his insights about love's metaphysical significance while affirming the value of embodied, particular mutual love between real human beings in all our glorious imperfection. Part 10. Cosmology and Metaphysics, the Divine Craftsman's Design. In the Timaeus, one of Plato's most difficult and speculative dialogues, he presents a creation myth that is also a sophisticated cosmology. Here, Plato addresses how the physical universe came to be, how it is structured, and how it relates to the eternal realm of forms. The resulting vision influenced Western cosmology for over 1,000 years, shaping medieval astronomy, early modern science, and religious conceptions of creation. Yet it is also filled with mythology, numerology, and speculation that can seem bizarre to modern readers. The dialogue begins with Timaeus, a Pythagorean philosopher, presenting an account of the cosmos's origin. He starts with a crucial distinction. There's being that always is and never becomes, the eternal forms, and there is becoming that never is but is always becoming, the physical world. Everything that becomes must have a cause. It cannot bring itself into existence. Therefore, the physical cosmos must have been created by a divine craftsman, whom Plato calls the demiurge, which simply means artisan or maker. But why did the demiurge create the cosmos? Because he was good, and being good, he wanted to create something good, to share goodness and prevent anything from being ugly or disordered. The demiurge looked to the eternal forms as his model and shaped chaotic matter into an ordered cosmos that resembles the forms as closely as possible. The physical universe is thus an image or copy of eternal reality, necessarily imperfect because it is made of matter, but as good as any physical thing can be. The demiurge creates the cosmos as a living being with body and soul. The body of the cosmos is the physical universe, shaped as a perfect sphere because the sphere is the most perfect shape, containing all other shapes within itself. The soul of the cosmos, the world's soul, is a mixture of being, sameness and difference, mathematical and metaphysical principles that the demiurge blends together and shapes into harmonious proportions. This world soul pervades the entire cosmos, giving it life, motion and rationality. Time itself is a creation of the demiurge. Before the cosmos there was no time, only eternity, the timeless existence of the forms. The demiurge created time as a moving image of eternity, a way for the temporal realm to imitate the eternal. The regular motions of celestial bodies, the sun, moon and planets, create time by measuring duration. Days, months and years are not arbitrary human conventions, but reflect the structure the demiurge built into the cosmos. Time is cosmic, not psychological or conventional. The four elements, earth, water, air and fire, are constructed from geometric forms. The demiurge takes basic triangles and assembles them into the regular solids discovered by mathematicians. Earth corresponds to the cube, water to the icosahedron, air to the octahedron, and fire to the tetrahedron. These shapes can transform into each other by breaking down into triangles and reassembling, which explains how elements can change, water evaporating into air or condensing into earth. This is an attempt to reduce physical reality to mathematical structure, to show that the material world is ultimately rational and orderly. The demiurge creates the heavenly bodies as divine living beings. The fixed stars are immortal gods, each a living creature with a soul. The planets, which the Greeks called wandering stars, are also divine beings moving in complex but perfectly rational patterns. The demiurge makes these celestial gods first and gives them the task of creating mortal living beings, humans and animals. This explains evil and imperfection in the world. The demiurge made everything as good as possible, but the subordinate gods he created introduced imperfections when they made mortal creatures. Human souls have a complex structure, according to the Timaeus. The rational part of the soul comes directly from the demiurge, made of the same mixture that composes the world's soul. But the subordinate gods add mortal parts, the spirited and appetitive parts, which are responsible for passion and desire. They place the immortal rational soul in the head, which is spherical like the cosmos itself, and the mortal parts in the chest and abdomen. This physiological account connects psychology to cosmology. The human being is a microcosm reflecting the structure of the macrocosm. The body is a vehicle for the soul, necessary for our existence in the physical world, but also a source of problems. The soul needs sensory organs to perceive the physical world, but sensations disturb the soul's circular motions and interfere with rational thought. The body requires nourishment, which creates desires that pull the soul toward physical pleasures. Disease occurs when the body's elements become imbalanced, and this imbalance affects the soul as well. The relationship between soul and body is inherently problematic because the eternal soul is joined to a temporal, decaying body. Plato provides detailed accounts of perception, physiology, and disease. Vision occurs when fire from the eye meets fire from the sun, creating a medium through which we perceive objects. Hearing occurs through vibrations in air that strike the ear and shake the soul. Diseases have natural causes in imbalances of elements and can be treated by restoring proper proportion. This is an attempt at scientific explanation, using the best physical theories available in ancient Greece, though much of it is now known to be incorrect. The cosmos operates according to necessity as well as reason. The demiurge is not all-powerful. He works with pre-existing matter and the laws of necessity. Necessity is blind, mechanical causation. The brute facts of how matter behaves. Reason persuades necessity to cooperate in creating order, but it cannot completely overcome necessity's resistance. This explains why the physical world is imperfect. Not everything happens for a rational purpose. Some things result from necessity rather than design. This is Plato's answer to the problem of evil. Imperfection in the world results from the limitations of matter, not from divine malevolence. The Timaeus presents a teleological universe where everything has a purpose. Eyes are for seeing, ears for hearing, legs for walking, reason for understanding eternal truth. The cosmos itself exists to be a visible God, an image of eternal reality that allows embodied souls to know the forms by studying their reflection in nature. Natural philosophy, studying the cosmos, is thus a religious activity, a way of knowing the divine by understanding creation. This teleological worldview dominated Western thought until modern science replaced it with mechanical causation. But from a modern scientific perspective, the Timaeus is filled with errors and speculation. The earth is not the center of the universe. Celestial bodies are not divine living beings. The elements are not made of geometric shapes. Time did not begin with the universe, but is a dimension of space-time that has no absolute beginning or end in current physics. The teleological explanations have been replaced by efficient causation. We explain natural phenomena by prior physical causes, not by purposes or goals. The demiurge appears to be an unnecessary hypothesis, adding nothing to our understanding of how the universe actually works. The entire framework of creation by a divine craftsman contradicts Plato's own theory of forms. If forms are eternal and unchanging, how can they be used as models for creation? If the physical world is becoming, and never truly is, how can it be said to exist at all? The demiurge himself is puzzling. Is he a form or a physical being or something in between? These tensions suggest that the Timaeus may be, as Plato hints, a likely story rather than literal truth, a provisional mythical account rather than final metaphysical doctrine. Yet the dialogue contains insights that remain philosophically interesting. The idea that the universe has mathematical structure, that nature operates according to rational principles accessible to human understanding, became foundational for modern science. Galileo's claim that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics echoes Platonic cosmology. The search for elegant mathematical laws underlying physical phenomena continues the project that Timaeus begins, discovering order and rationality in nature. The distinction between reason and necessity, between purposeful design and brute mechanical causation, raises questions that remain unsettled. Does the universe have purposes built into it, or do purposes exist only in conscious minds? Modern biology debates whether teleological language is appropriate for describing evolution and adaptation. Physicists debate whether the laws of nature could have been different or whether they follow from some deeper, rational necessity. These are descendants of Plato's attempt to understand how reason and necessity interact in creating the cosmos. The world-soul concept has found surprising echoes in contemporary thought. The Gaia hypothesis in ecology treats Earth as a self-regulating system with properties similar to a living organism. Systems theory and complexity science study emergent properties of large-scale organized systems that can appear purposeful without conscious intention. While no serious scientist believes the universe literally has a soul, the idea that complex systems can exhibit holistic properties not reducible to their parts remains scientifically important. The Timaeus also reveals the connection between cosmology and ethics in Plato's thought. Understanding the cosmos is not just intellectual curiosity, but moral necessity. By studying the orderly motions of celestial bodies, we learn what order means and can impose it on our own souls. By recognizing the rational structure of the universe, we understand our own rational nature. By seeing how the demiurge created the best possible world from imperfect materials, we learn how to live the best possible life within our own limitations. Cosmology is ethics writ large, and ethics is cosmology writ small. The problem of evil receives a sophisticated treatment in the Timaeus. Evil exists not because the demiurge is malevolent or incompetent, but because creation necessarily involves limitation. The demiurge makes things as good as they can be given the constraints of matter and necessity. Imperfection is inevitable in anything physical and temporal. This theodicy, this justification of divine goodness despite worldly evil, influenced Christian theology profoundly. Augustine and other Christian thinkers adapted Plato's solution, arguing that evil is a privation of good rather than a positive force, a necessary consequence of creating finite beings. The hierarchy of being in the Timaeus establishes a great chain that medieval philosophers would elaborate. At the top is the realm of forms, eternal and perfect. Below that is the demiurge, the divine craftsman. Then come the celestial gods, the stars and planets, then the world soul pervading the cosmos, then rational souls in human beings, then mortal animals and plants, finally inert matter at the bottom. Everything has its proper place in this hierarchy, and cosmic order depends on maintaining these distinctions. But this hierarchical cosmology has been used to justify earthly hierarchies in problematic ways. If the cosmos itself is hierarchical, with higher beings ruling lower beings, then social hierarchy seems natural and right. Medieval society used Platonic cosmology to justify monarchy, aristocracy, and rigid class distinctions. The great chain of being became an ideology of domination, making inequality seem like part of the natural order. This shows how abstract metaphysical theories can have concrete political consequences, how seemingly neutral cosmological speculation can reinforce systems of power. Modern physics presents a very different picture of the cosmos. There is no centre and no circumference, no above and below, no hierarchy of being. The laws of physics operate uniformly throughout space and time. Matter and energy are convertible, following Einstein's famous equation. The universe may have begun with a big bang or may be eternal in some more complex sense. Purpose plays no role in fundamental physics. Everything follows from initial conditions and natural laws. The Platonic cosmos seems like a beautiful dream with no correspondence to physical reality. Yet the Timaeus remains philosophically significant because it addresses perennial questions. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? Why is the universe orderly rather than chaotic? How does mind relate to matter? What is the relationship between mathematics and physical reality? Why are the laws of nature the way they are? These questions persist even after we reject Plato's specific answers. The dialogue shows one deeply thoughtful attempt to make sense of existence, and even its failures are instructive. Perhaps the deepest contribution of the Timaeus is its vision of philosophy as comprehensive understanding. Plato attempts to integrate metaphysics, cosmology, mathematics, physics, physiology, psychology, and ethics into a single coherent system. Everything connects to everything else. The structure of the cosmos reflects the nature of reality. Human beings are microcosms of the universe. Understanding nature helps us understand ourselves and how to live. This ambition for unified knowledge, for a theory of everything, continues to drive philosophical and scientific inquiry. We may not accept Plato's synthesis, but we still seek the connections he tried to reveal. Part 11. Art, Poetry and Rhetoric, the Ancient Quarrel. Plato's relationship with art and poetry is one of the most paradoxical aspects of his philosophy. He was himself a brilliant literary artist who wrote dialogues of extraordinary beauty, yet he argued that poets should be banished from the ideal city. He recognized the power of rhetoric to move audiences, yet he dismissed most rhetoric as deceptive manipulation. He acknowledged that beauty draws us toward truth, yet he claimed that art distances us from reality. This apparent contradiction has puzzled readers for centuries and sparked endless debates about the value of art. The attack on poetry in the Republic is shocking in its severity. Plato argues that poets should be excluded from the city, or at least strictly censored, because they corrupt the souls of citizens. This is not a fringe position or a passing remark. It is a sustained argument occupying significant portions of the dialogue. Plato was serious about this, and understanding why requires grasping his entire metaphysical and epistemological framework. The first charge against poetry is metaphysical. It deals with mere images of images, putting us at 3 removes from reality. Remember the theory of forms. The carpenter making a bed looks to the form of bed and creates a physical bed which is already a copy of the form. The painter painting the bed copies the physical bed, creating an image of an image. The poet describing the bed in verse creates yet another level of imitation. At each level we move further from reality toward appearance. The poet, far from being wise, is the most ignorant, dealing with the shadows of shadows, but the metaphysical critique goes deeper. Poetry does not require knowledge of what it depicts. Homer writes about war without being a general, about governance without being a ruler, about carpentry without being a carpenter. The poet imitates appearances without understanding reality. This is why poets cannot answer questions about their subject matter. They create beautiful words that sound wise but contain no genuine knowledge. If Homer really understood virtue and politics, he would be a legislator or educator, not a poet. That he remained a poet proves his ignorance. The second charge is psychological and moral. Poetry corrupts by appealing to the lower parts of the soul. Tragedy and epic, the most prestigious genres, depict heroes overwhelmed by emotion, wailing in grief, raging in anger, driven by passion. The audience identifies with these characters, experiencing vicarious emotions. This strengthens the appetitive and spirited parts of the soul at reason's expense. We become what we imitate, and imitating characters who lack self-control makes us lose self-control. Poetry trains us in vice rather than virtue. Even comedy is dangerous because it makes us laugh at shameful things. We enjoy jokes about cruelty, vulgarity and vice, things we would condemn in real life. This creates a split in the soul between what reason judges as bad and what we enjoy as entertaining. The soul becomes divided against itself, unable to maintain consistent values. Poetry undermines moral education by making vice attractive and virtue boring. The third charge concerns poetry's emotional manipulation. Poetry works through charm and enchantment, not through reason and argument. It bypasses our rational judgment and directly moves our emotions. We can know intellectually that tragic heroes should control themselves, yet we still cry at their suffering. We can know that we should not enjoy violence, yet we still thrill at epic battle scenes. Poetry has a kind of magic that overwhelms our better judgment, and this makes it dangerous to the well-ordered soul. Plato extends similar criticisms to rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. Most rhetoric is flattery rather than true art, he argues in the Gorgias. Just as cosmetics make people appear healthy without actually improving health, rhetoric makes arguments appear convincing without actually being true. The rhetorician, like the pastry chef who gives pleasure rather than nutrition, aims at gratification rather than genuine benefit. Rhetoric is to justice what cosmetics is to gymnastics, a counterfeit that mimics the real thing. The good rhetorician, like the demagogue in the assembly, can make the worse argument appear the better. They can make injustice seem like justice, foolishness seem like wisdom, vice seem like virtue. This is not just harmless persuasion, it is deeply corrupting. It makes audiences unable to distinguish truth from falsehood, right from wrong. A society where rhetoric dominates over philosophy becomes a society where appearance matters more than reality, where persuasion trumps truth. Democracy itself becomes impossible when citizens cannot think critically but are swayed by whoever speaks most convincingly. Yet here is the paradox. Plato's own dialogues are works of extraordinary literary and rhetorical art. They use dramatic setting, character development, vivid imagery, emotional appeal, everything he criticizes in poetry. The allegory of the cave is more myth than argument. The speech of Aristophanes in the Symposium is pure fiction. The death scene of Socrates in the Phaedo is crafted for maximum emotional impact. How can Plato condemn artistic techniques while using them masterfully himself? One answer is that Plato distinguishes between good and bad uses of art. Art in service to truth is acceptable, even valuable, but art for its own sake, or in service to falsehood, is dangerous. The dialogues use literary technique to lead readers toward philosophical truth. They are means to an end rather than ends in themselves. The myths Plato tells, like the myth of or the creation story in the Timaeus, are explicitly offered as likely stories that point toward truths that cannot be demonstrated directly. This is philosophical poetry, art subordinated to wisdom. The Ion presents another critique of poetry as divine madness rather than rational art. The rhapsode Ion claims expertise in Homer, but Socrates shows that Ion cannot explain what he knows or apply it beyond recitation. Ion's ability comes not from knowledge but from divine inspiration, a kind of possession where the muse speaks through him. This sounds like praise, but it is actually devastating. If poetry is divine madness, then poets have no control over their creations and no understanding of what they produce. They are merely vessels for forces they do not comprehend. This raises a fundamental question about artistic creation. Is it rational or non-rational? Plato insists that genuine knowledge must be articulable. The knower must be able to explain and justify what they know. But artists often cannot explain how they create or why their works succeed or fail. They speak of inspiration, intuition, the unconscious, things that happen beyond rational control. For Plato, this proves that art is not a form of knowledge. For defenders of art, it suggests that not all valuable human achievements require the kind of explicit, rational understanding Plato demands. The critique of mimesis, imitation, also has interesting implications. Plato argues that art is imitation of appearances, therefore inferior to reality and further still from the forms. But this assumes that art aims to copy reality. What if art does something else, transforms reality, reveals aspects of reality not otherwise visible, creates new realities? Modern aesthetic theory has largely rejected the imitation theory of art. Art is not trying and failing to copy the world, but doing something entirely different, expressing emotion, creating beauty, exploring possibilities, provoking thought. Aristotle's response to Plato in the Poetics is illuminating. Aristotle argues that poetry is more philosophical than history because it depicts universal patterns rather than particular facts. Tragedy shows not what happened to this particular person, but what could happen to people of a certain type in certain situations. This is closer to the universal truth Plato values than historical chronicles of particular events. Moreover, tragedy provides a kind of emotional education, allowing us to experience and master dangerous emotions in a safe context. The catharsis of pity and fear purifies the soul rather than corrupting it. The question of whether art requires knowledge remains debated. Some philosophers argue that great art embodies a kind of practical wisdom, insight into human nature, moral understanding, even if not expressible as propositional knowledge. Others accept Plato's point that artistic skill is distinct from knowledge of subject matter, that you can write brilliantly about love without understanding love, depict war vividly without knowing military strategy. But this does not necessarily make art worthless. It might just mean that art has a different kind of value than knowledge. Plato's concern about art's emotional power is not entirely misguided. Propaganda, advertising, and mass media do manipulate emotions to bypass rational judgment, exactly as Plato feared. Images and stories can inflame prejudice, glorify violence, normalize vice. The power of narrative to shape beliefs and values, for better or worse, is something every society must grapple with. Plato's error was not recognizing this power, but thinking it could or should be eliminated rather than cultivated and directed wisely. The censorship Plato advocates seems intolerable to modern sensibilities. We value artistic freedom, diversity of expression, the right to encounter challenging and disturbing ideas. A society where philosopher-kings decide what art is permissible seems totalitarian, crushing creativity and independent thought. Yet even liberal societies impose some limits on expression, prohibiting certain forms of hate speech, child pornography, incitement to violence. The question is not whether to limit expression at all, but where to draw the line and who decides. The relationship between art and morality remains philosophically contested. Does art have moral obligations? Should it promote virtue and discourage vice, as Plato demands, or is it amoral, valuable regardless of moral content? Can immoral art be great art? These questions divide critics, artists, and philosophers. Some argue that aesthetic and moral values are independent, others that they necessarily intersect, that truly great art must have moral substance. Plato's insistence that art serves either virtue or vice, never remaining neutral, represents one influential position in this ongoing debate. The positive conception of rhetoric in the Phaedrus offers a more balanced view. Here Plato admits that genuine rhetoric is possible, rhetoric based on knowledge of truth and souls. The true rhetorician must know the truth about the subject, understand the nature of the soul and its parts, and match arguments to different types of souls. This is philosophical rhetoric, using persuasive techniques to lead audiences toward truth rather than away from it. It is the art Plato himself practices in the dialogues, combining philosophical argument with dramatic presentation. This suggests that Plato's real objection is not to art or rhetoric as such, but to their misuse. Art that reflects truth and promotes virtue is valuable. Art that distorts reality and glorifies vice is dangerous. Rhetoric that persuades people to accept truth is philosophical. Rhetoric that persuades them to accept falsehood is sophistry. The problem is determining which is which, and Plato's answer is that only philosophers who know the forms can make this judgment. This brings us back to the authoritarian implications we have seen throughout his philosophy. Contemporary aesthetic theory has largely moved beyond Plato's concerns. Instead of asking whether art represents reality accurately or promotes virtue, we ask what experiences art creates, what meanings it generates, how it affects culture. Art is understood as a complex social practice with multiple functions, not reducible to mimesis or moral instruction. But Plato's questions about art's relationship to truth and its effect on character have not disappeared. They have been reframed in ways that reflect different assumptions about art's nature and value. The tension between philosophy and poetry, what Plato calls an ancient quarrel, reflects a deeper tension between different modes of understanding. Philosophy seeks explicit knowledge, clear arguments, universal principles expressible in precise language. Poetry works through image and metaphor, through suggestion rather than statement, through particular instances that resist generalization. Philosophy wants to climb from particulars to universals. Poetry wants to embody universals in memorable particulars. These are different ways of engaging with reality, and Plato's attempt to subordinate poetry to philosophy may fail to recognize the distinctive value of poetic understanding. Ultimately, the question is whether Plato's mistrust of art reveals a profound insight or a profound blind spot. Did he see dangers that we ignore at our peril, the way art can manipulate emotions, spread falsehood and corrupt character? Or did he fail to appreciate how art enriches life, expands imagination, and deepens understanding in ways that discursive philosophy cannot? The answer may be both. Plato's critique contains important warnings about art's power, but his solution, censorship by philosophical guardians, is worse than the disease. The challenge is to cultivate critical appreciation of art, to recognize both its potential for insight and its potential for manipulation, without falling into either uncritical celebration or authoritarian control. Part 12. The Socratic Method and Dialectic, Philosophy as Conversation. The way Plato does philosophy is as important as what he concludes. Instead of writing systematic treatises that present doctrines for acceptance, he wrote dialogues where characters argue, question and struggle toward understanding. This method, inherited from his teacher Socrates and refined into the philosophical technique called Dialectic, represents a revolutionary approach to truth-seeking. It suggests that philosophy is not about receiving wisdom from experts, but about thinking together, questioning assumptions, and following arguments wherever they lead. The Socratic method, as depicted in the dialogues, typically begins with a question about the nature of something. What is justice? What is courage? What is knowledge? What is virtue? Someone offers a definition, confident they understand the concept. Socrates then asks questions that reveal problems with the definition. Through this process of questioning, the interlocutor realizes their initial confidence was misplaced. They did not really understand what they thought they understood. This moment of recognizing ignorance, the awareness that we do not know what we thought we knew, is the beginning of wisdom. The questioning has a characteristic pattern. Socrates asks for definitions, universal accounts that apply to all cases rather than particular examples. If someone says courage is standing firm in battle, Socrates points out that courage appears in many situations beyond battle, so standing firm cannot be what courage essentially is. If someone says justice is helping friends and harming enemies, Socrates shows this leads to contradictions. The just person would make people worse by harming them, but justice should make people better. Each proposed definition is tested against counterexamples and logical implications until it collapses. This method is called elenchus, from the Greek word for examination or refutation. The goal is not simply to defeat the interlocutor, but to examine their beliefs, to test whether they are consistent and coherent. Socrates compares himself to a gadfly stinging a sluggish horse, awakening Athens from intellectual complacency. He also compares himself to a midwife, helping others give birth to ideas, using questions to draw out understanding rather than implanting his own views. The method is maieutic, helping others discover truth for themselves. But the elenchus often ends in aporia, puzzlement or impasse. Many dialogues conclude without reaching a satisfactory definition. What is courage, the Laches asks, and ends uncertain. What is friendship, the Lysis asks, and ends confused. What is self-control, the Charmides asks, and ends nowhere. This can be frustrating. We read a whole dialogue only to reach no conclusion. But Plato may think this frustration is valuable. Recognizing that we do not know is progress over falsely believing we know. Aporia is not failure, but the first step toward genuine understanding. Socrates claims to know nothing, except that he knows nothing. This Socratic ignorance is not false modesty, but an essential philosophical stance. Unlike the sophists who claim to teach wisdom, or the poets who claim divine inspiration, or the politicians who claim expertise, Socrates admits his ignorance. This admission makes him wiser than others. The oracle at Delphi declared him the wisest because he alone knows he is not wise. Real wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of our understanding, yet this creates a paradox. If Socrates knows nothing, how can he recognize when others are wrong? If he has no positive views, how can he test whether proposed definitions are adequate? The Elenchus seems to presuppose standards of correctness that Socrates claims not to possess. This has led scholars to debate whether Socrates really has no views, or whether his profession of ignorance is ironic, a pedagogical device to make others think, rather than a literal description of his epistemic state. Dialectic, as distinguished from the Socratic Elenchus, is a more advanced method that appears in later dialogues. While Elenchus is primarily negative, refuting false beliefs, dialectic is positive, constructing knowledge through systematic questioning. In the Republic, dialectic is the highest form of reasoning, the method by which philosophers grasp the forms themselves. It proceeds not from hypotheses taken as given, but from hypotheses treated as stepping stones, examining their presuppositions until reaching first principles that need no further justification. The dialectical method has two movements, upward and downward. The upward path goes from hypotheses to the unhypothetical first principles that ground everything else. For example, mathematicians assume the existence of numbers and reason from there, but dialecticians question what numbers are, why they exist, how they relate to forms. This questioning continues until reaching the form of the good, the ultimate principle that cannot be doubted because it grounds the possibility of all knowledge. The downward path then derives consequences from these first principles, showing how everything else follows necessarily. This makes dialectic very different from what we usually call logic or argumentation. It is not about winning debates or proving conclusions from premises. It is about understanding how reality hangs together, how everything connects to everything else, how particular truths depend on universal principles. The dialectician sees the whole, the systematic unity of knowledge, not just isolated facts or arguments. This synoptic vision, this ability to see connections others miss, is what distinguishes philosophical understanding from expertise in particular domains. The dialogue form itself embodies Plato's conception of philosophy. Philosophy is not monologue but conversation, not receiving doctrine but collaborative inquiry. The characters represent different viewpoints, different approaches, different levels of understanding. As they argue and question each other, readers participate in the inquiry, following arguments, noticing problems, forming their own views. The dialogue invites readers to think actively rather than passively accept what they are told. Yet Plato's use of the dialogue form creates interpretive challenges. Which character represents Plato's own views, if any? Socrates is the main character in most dialogues, but does Plato agree with everything Socrates says? When characters disagree, which is right? Are we supposed to accept the conclusions reached or notice their problems? Plato never speaks in his own voice. He hides behind his characters, and this makes determining his actual beliefs difficult. Some scholars think this is intentional. Plato wants us to think for ourselves rather than defer to his authority. The Socratic method faces serious philosophical objections. First, it seems purely negative, good at refuting beliefs but unable to establish positive knowledge. If every proposed definition gets refuted, how do we ever arrive at truth? Socrates cannot just question forever. At some point he must offer constructive answers. Some dialogues do reach positive conclusions, but the method seems better suited to destruction than construction. This is why Plato develops the doctrine of recollection, to explain how questioning can lead to knowledge. The answers are already within us, waiting to be recovered. Second, the method seems to assume what it seeks to prove. Socrates refutes definitions by showing they lead to absurd consequences, but what counts as absurd depends on prior beliefs about what is reasonable. If someone simply accepts the absurd consequence, there is no refutation. The method works only if interlocutors share enough background beliefs that contradictions are genuinely problematic. But this means the method cannot challenge our deepest assumptions, only beliefs that conflict with other beliefs we hold more firmly. Third, the Socratic method can be abused as a weapon of sophistry rather than truth-seeking. Clever questioners can trap people in apparent contradictions, make them look foolish, win arguments without caring about truth. The method's power to confuse and embarrass can be used for domination rather than enlightenment. Plato was aware of this danger. In the Republic he warns against teaching dialectic to the young, who will use it to undermine all beliefs rather than seeking truth. The method requires not just skill but proper motivation and character. Fourth, the obsession with definitions may be misguided. Does every concept have an essence that can be captured in a verbal formula? Maybe some concepts are irreducibly complex or context-dependent, lacking the kind of unity Socrates seeks. Maybe knowledge is possible without being able to define what we know. The definition requirement may set an impossible standard that leads to unwarranted skepticism. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein's later critique. Words get their meaning from use in context rather than by referring to essential natures. Yet the Socratic method has proven extraordinarily influential and continues to be used today. Law schools teach through the Socratic method, professors questioning students about cases to develop legal reasoning. Philosophy classes use it to engage students actively with arguments. Therapy and counseling sometimes use Socratic questioning to help clients examine their beliefs and assumptions. The method's power to provoke thought, reveal hidden contradictions, and develop critical thinking makes it valuable regardless of its theoretical limitations. The emphasis on examining one's own life, central to Socratic philosophy, remains urgently relevant. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates declares at his trial. We must question our beliefs, test our assumptions, seek coherence and truth, rather than accepting whatever we were taught or whatever feels comfortable. This commitment to self-examination, to intellectual integrity, to following argument wherever it leads regardless of consequences, defines the philosophical life. It is not just about acquiring knowledge, but about living with awareness and honesty. The Socratic method also embodies a democratic ideal, at least in principle. Philosophy is not restricted to experts with special training or privileged insight. Anyone who can reason can participate. Socrates questions everyone: politicians, poets, craftsmen, slaves, women, young and old. The ability to think clearly and examine beliefs is universal, not the property of any class or group. This stands in tension with Plato's later elitism, his claim that only philosophers can know truth, but the Socratic starting point is radically egalitarian. The dialogue form also allows Plato to present ideas tentatively, as proposals to be tested rather than dogmas to be accepted. Characters offer theories, other characters object, arguments are examined and sometimes rejected. This models how philosophy should work, not as the pronouncement of authority, but as the collaborative testing of ideas. Even when Plato believes something strongly, presenting it in dialogue form acknowledges that it remains open to question, that philosophy is ongoing inquiry rather than finished system. Contemporary philosophers continue to debate what makes an argument dialectical rather than merely logical. Some think dialectic involves examining beliefs we actually hold rather than just testing logical validity. Others think it requires understanding how individual arguments fit into systematic unity. Others think it means testing arguments against lived experience rather than just formal consistency. The concept of dialectic is itself contested, but the general idea that philosophy involves more than deductive logic, that it requires synthetic understanding and practical wisdom, remains important. The relationship between dialectic and rhetoric is also philosophically rich. Rhetoric persuades without necessarily seeking truth. Dialectic seeks truth through systematic questioning. But the boundary is unclear. Good dialectic may involve some rhetorical skill to engage interlocutors effectively. Good rhetoric may require understanding truth to be genuinely persuasive. Perhaps the distinction is one of aim rather than method. Dialectic aims at understanding while rhetoric aims at persuasion, even when they use similar techniques. The Socratic Method's greatest legacy may be its insistence that we can improve our thinking through discipline and practice. Philosophy is not about being naturally smart or having special intuitions, but about learning to question well, to notice assumptions, to follow arguments carefully, to test beliefs against each other. These are learnable skills. By engaging in dialectical exchange, we become better thinkers. The method itself educates, shaping minds that can think clearly and recognize truth. Perhaps the deepest insight is that philosophy is fundamentally social, not solitary. We need others to challenge our ideas, to point out what we miss, to help us see from different perspectives. Thinking alone, we are likely to remain trapped in our assumptions. In dialogue with others, we can break free and approach truth. This is why Plato wrote dialogues rather than treatises, why he founded the Academy as a place for philosophical conversation, why he saw philosophy as an essentially communal activity. Truth emerges not from individual genius, but from collective inquiry, from the clash and cooperation of different minds pursuing understanding together. Part 13. Later Works and Self-Critiques. The philosopher questions himself. Plato did something almost unprecedented among ancient philosophers. He questioned and sometimes abandoned his own theories. The later dialogues show Plato grappling with problems in his earlier doctrines, particularly the theory of forms, and either refining, revising, or possibly rejecting what he had previously taught. This intellectual honesty, this willingness to identify weaknesses in his own system, makes Plato not just a systematic philosopher, but a genuinely self-critical thinker. Understanding these later developments is essential for seeing the full arc of his thought. The Parmenides contains the most devastating critique of the theory of forms found anywhere, and it comes from Plato himself. Young Socrates presents the theory to the elderly philosopher Parmenides, who proceeds to tear it apart with a series of sophisticated arguments. These are not superficial objections, but deep philosophical problems that strike at the heart of the theory. What makes them especially significant is that Plato offers no clear response. The dialogue ends with the problems unresolved, leaving readers to wonder whether Plato has abandoned the forms or is inviting us to solve problems he could not. The third man argument, which we mentioned earlier, appears in the Parmenides. If multiple things are F because they participate in the form of F, then the form and the particular things have something in common. But then there must be another form to account for what the first form and the particulars have in common, and another form to account for what those have in common, and so on, infinitely. This infinite regress makes the theory of forms incoherent. If we need an infinite number of forms to explain anything, we have explained nothing. Another problem concerns participation itself, the relationship between forms and particulars. If a form is wholly present in each particular that participates in it, then the form is divided and no longer one. But if only part of the form is present in each particular, then the form has parts and is not simple and perfect. Either way, we lose the unity and simplicity essential to forms. The participation relation which the whole theory depends on seems to be inexplicable. There is also the problem of forms of relative terms and negations. Is there a form of large, and if so, is it itself large or small? If it is large, it participates in itself, which seems circular. If it is small, then the form of large is small, which is contradictory. Similar problems arise for forms of relations like master and slave, and for negative forms like not beautiful. The theory seems to work for simple, positive properties like justice and beauty, but breaks down when extended to the full range of concepts we use. Most troubling is what scholars call the separation problem. If forms exist in a separate realm, completely distinct from the physical world, how can they have any effect on physical things? How can particulars participate in or resemble forms if forms are utterly separate? And how can we know forms if they exist beyond the physical world we inhabit? The theory of forms explains the physical world by reference to a transcendent realm, but the connection between the realms seems impossible to maintain. The cure is worse than the disease. The Parmenides offers no solutions to these problems. Some scholars think Plato is inviting readers to develop solutions, treating the dialogue as an exercise in philosophical problem-solving. Others think Plato himself could not solve these problems and was signalling that the theory of forms needs major revision or abandonment. The dialogue's ambiguity makes interpretation difficult, but its critical power is undeniable. These objections have troubled every subsequent Platonist, and no fully satisfactory response has been found. The sophist and statesman show Plato developing new philosophical methods and revising old doctrines. Instead of the early forms which seem to exist in splendid isolation from each other, the later theory presents forms as interrelated in complex ways. Some forms blend with others, some exclude others, and understanding any form requires understanding its relations to other forms. Being itself becomes a problem. What does it mean to say a form is, and how does being relate to not being? These are metaphysical questions at a level of sophistication beyond the earlier dialogues. The problem of not being is particularly important. Parmenides had argued that we cannot speak or think about what is not, because not being is nothing and you cannot refer to nothing. But this makes falsehood impossible. A false statement would have to be about what is not, but we just said that is impossible. In the Sophist, Plato tries to solve this by redefining not being as difference rather than absolute negation. To say something is not beautiful is not to say it participates in absolute nothingness, but to say it is different from beautiful things. This allows both false statements and negative properties to make sense. The Theaetetus presents a sustained examination of knowledge that reaches no clear conclusion. 3 definitions are proposed and refuted. Knowledge is perception, knowledge is true belief, knowledge is true belief with an account. Each definition faces problems that seem insurmountable. But unlike the confident epistemology of the Republic with its divided line and forms, the Theaetetus ends in aporia. Plato seems less certain about what knowledge is and how we attain it. The dialogue suggests that the simple equations of earlier works, knowledge equals grasping forms, was too crude. The Philebus tackles the question of what makes life good, pleasure or knowledge. Instead of the stark dichotomy between philosophical life and life of pleasure found in earlier dialogues, Plato now suggests that the best life combines both. Pure pleasure without reason would be subhuman, but pure reason without any pleasure would be incomplete. The good life requires a mixture, with reason providing measure and structure to pleasure. This is a more nuanced ethical position than the earlier harsh rejection of pleasure as incompatible with virtue. The Laws, Plato's longest work and probably his last, presents a more realistic political philosophy. Instead of the ideal city ruled by philosopher-kings, the Laws describes a second-best city governed by detailed laws and traditional religion. There are no communal families, no abolition of private property, no philosopher rulers. Instead, there are elaborate legal codes covering everything from property ownership to religious festivals. This suggests Plato recognized that his ideal republic was impossible and tried to design the best achievable state given human limitations. Yet, the Laws is in some ways more authoritarian than the Republic. It prescribes in minute detail how citizens should live, what they should believe, even what they should think. Atheism is a crime punishable by death. Education is rigidly controlled. The state surveils citizens to ensure compliance. If the Republic was a beautiful but impractical dream, the Laws is a suffocating nightmare that takes itself as practical. Plato seems to have moved from impossible idealism to oppressive realism without finding a middle ground. The dialogue form itself changes in the later works. Early dialogues feature Socrates as the main speaker, engaging in lively debate with multiple interlocutors. Later dialogues often replace Socrates with other speakers, or reduce his role to passive listener, or present long speeches rather than back-and-forth questioning. The Timaeus is mostly a monologue. The Laws is a conversation among elderly men that feels more like a treatise in dialogue form than a genuine exchange. The dramatic life drains out, replaced by systematic exposition. Scholars debate whether these changes reflect evolution in Plato's thought or simply different pedagogical purposes. Did he lose faith in the Socratic method, or did he think some topics require extended explanation rather than question and answer? Did he abandon the theory of forms, or did he just refine it in ways that make it less dramatic but more defensible? Different scholars reading the same texts reach opposite conclusions, showing how difficult interpretation becomes in these complex later works. The seventh letter, if genuine and written by Plato, provides autobiographical context for understanding his development. Plato describes his early hopes for political involvement, his disillusionment with Athenian politics after Socrates' execution, his failed attempts to educate the tyrant Dionysius in Sicily. He suggests that genuine philosophy requires withdrawing from politics while also maintaining that philosophers have a duty to improve society when possible. The letter portrays Plato as deeply conflicted, torn between the contemplative life and the active life, never fully satisfied with either choice. The letter also contains a famous passage about philosophical knowledge. The most important things cannot be written down, Plato says, but must be grasped directly through living philosophical conversation. Written works, including his own dialogues, are merely pointers toward truths that must be discovered personally. This raises questions about what Plato really believed. If he thought the dialogues are inadequate, why did he write them? If the real teaching happened in the academy, through oral discussion, we have lost access to the core of Plato's philosophy and possess only its preliminary exercises. The later dialogues show Plato as a more cautious, more sceptical thinker. The youthful confidence that forms can be grasped and knowledge achieved gives way to recognition of philosophical difficulty. Problems that seemed solved earlier are reopened. Doctrines that seemed established are questioned. This might be seen as intellectual decline, the aging philosopher losing his grip, but it can also be seen as wisdom, the mature recognition that reality is more complex than youthful theories acknowledged. Contemporary scholars are divided on how to interpret these developments. Some see continuity, arguing that Plato's basic commitments remain constant while he refines details and addresses objections. Others see radical breaks, arguing that Plato abandoned core doctrines and adopted fundamentally different positions. Still others deny there is a single Platonic philosophy at all, seeing the dialogues as independent explorations of different ideas rather than chapters in a systematic work. The diversity of interpretation itself says something about the ambiguity and richness of Plato's later thought. Perhaps the most important lesson from the later dialogues is that good philosophy requires self-criticism. Plato was willing to identify problems in his own theories, to expose them to the strongest objections he could devise, even when he could not fully answer those objections. This intellectual honesty is rare and admirable. Too many philosophers become attached to their systems, defending them against all objections, interpreting problems away rather than acknowledging them. Plato shows us that true philosophical integrity requires being as critical of our own ideas as we are of others. The later works also demonstrate that philosophical progress is not linear. We do not simply move from ignorance to knowledge, from confusion to clarity, from error to truth. We circle back to old questions, find new problems in supposed solutions, realize that what we thought we knew was more complicated than we believed. Philosophy is not a path with a clear endpoint, but an ongoing exploration that generates new questions as it answers old ones. The Socratic confession of ignorance remains valid. We always know less than we think we do. The tension between Plato's earlier and later works reflects tensions in philosophy itself. Between systematic construction and critical analysis, between building theories and tearing them down, between achieving answers and deepening questions. Between the confidence needed to propose solutions and the humility needed to recognize problems. Between vision and rigor, inspiration and logical precision, hope for understanding and awareness of limitations. These tensions cannot be fully resolved. They are inherent in the philosophical enterprise itself. Ultimately, the later dialogues make Plato a greater philosopher than he would have been without them. A thinker who simply proclaimed doctrines and defended them against all criticism would be less admirable than one who questioned his own conclusions. By exposing the problems in his own theories, Plato invites us to do better, to solve problems he could not solve, to think beyond what he thought. He becomes not the final authority, but the beginning of a conversation that continues to this day. His greatest achievement may be not his answers, but his questions, not his solutions, but the problems he identified with clarity and honesty. Part 14. Legacy and Influence, the Philosopher's Long Shadow. To understand Western philosophy is to understand Plato's influence, because almost every major philosophical movement has defined itself either with or against him. Alfred North Whitehead famously claimed that all Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato, an exaggeration perhaps, but one that captures an essential truth. For over 2,000 years, philosophers, theologians, scientists and artists have returned to Plato finding in his works inspiration, challenge, provocation and warning. His shadow stretches across the entire history of Western thought, sometimes illuminating, sometimes obscuring, but always present. Aristotle, Plato's most brilliant student, spent his philosophical career arguing with his teacher. He rejected the theory of forms, arguing that universals exist in particulars rather than in a separate realm. He rejected Plato's Epistemology, arguing that knowledge begins with sensory experience rather than recollection of prenatal insight. He rejected Plato's Politics, defending limited democracy and the political wisdom of ordinary citizens. Yet Aristotle's philosophy is unthinkable without Plato. Even in disagreement, Aristotle works within a framework Plato established, addressing problems Plato identified using methods Plato developed. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus in the 3rd century of the Common Era, transformed Plato into a mystical, religious philosopher. Plotinus interpreted the form of the good as an ineffable one beyond all being, the source from which all reality emanates like light from the sun. The soul's journey toward the forms became a mystical ascent toward union with the divine. Philosophy became spiritual practice, and contemplation became prayer. This Christianized Platonism would dominate Western thought for centuries, shaping Augustine, Aquinas, and medieval theology. But it was as much transformation as transmission. Plotinus created something new while claiming to interpret Plato. Early Christianity found in Plato a philosophical framework compatible with Scripture. The eternal forms became ideas in the mind of God. The divine craftsman became the Christian creator. The immortal soul became the soul awaiting resurrection. Christian Platonism emphasized the split between material and spiritual, body and soul, this world and the next. It often adopted Plato's asceticism, his hostility to the body and physical pleasure, his vision of philosophy as preparation for death. Augustine confessed that reading Plato helped him understand Christianity. The Platonist prepared his soul for revelation. But this Christianized Platonism sometimes distorted Plato's views. Plato was not a monotheist. He believed in many gods and a demiurge distinct from forms. He did not believe in creation from nothing. The demiurge shaped pre-existing matter. He did not promise personal immortality with preservation of individual identity. The soul might be reborn in different bodies with no memory of previous lives. Christian appropriation of Plato was selective, taking what fit Christian doctrine and ignoring what did not. Yet this synthesis of Platonism and Christianity became the dominant worldview of medieval Europe. The Renaissance recovery of Plato's actual texts challenged medieval interpretations. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino translated Plato directly from Greek, revealing how much Neoplatonism had added to or changed Plato's philosophy. Renaissance Platonism emphasized beauty, love and creativity rather than asceticism and world denial. The ladder of love from the Symposium inspired poets and artists. The theory of forms provided philosophical legitimacy for idealized beauty in art. This was a more humanistic Platonism, celebrating human potential rather than emphasizing human sinfulness. Modern philosophy often defined itself against Plato. Empiricists like John Locke rejected innate ideas and insisted that all knowledge comes from experience, directly contradicting Plato's theory of recollection. Materialists denied the existence of immaterial souls, dismissing Plato's dualism as superstition. Democratic theorists rejected rule by philosophical elites as elitist and dangerous. The scientific revolution replaced teleological explanation with mechanical causation, abandoning Plato's vision of a purposeful cosmos designed by a rational craftsman. Yet even in rejection, Plato's influence persists. Descartes' distinction between mind and body echoes Platonic dualism, even while claiming to start philosophy anew. Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, between how things appear and how they are in themselves, resembles the distinction between the physical world and the realm of forms. Leibniz's monadology, a vision of reality as composed of immaterial substances, is Platonism in modern dress. You can reject Plato explicitly while remaining Platonic in fundamental assumptions. Romanticism returned to Plato with enthusiasm. Romantic poets saw the artist as accessing higher reality through inspiration, much like the philosopher ascending to forms. Wordsworth's intimations of immortality from early childhood echo Plato's recollection theory. Shelley translated Plato and wrote that poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world, a Platonic claim about wisdom and political authority. The romantic idea that imagination reveals truth inaccessible to reason alone is profoundly Platonic, even as it inverts Plato's subordination of art to philosophy. German idealism, especially Hegel, represents perhaps the most sophisticated modern engagement with Plato. Hegel saw dialectic as the fundamental method of philosophy and reality itself, the way thought and being develop through contradiction and synthesis. He interpreted history as the progressive realization of reason, approaching something like Plato's form of the good. But Hegel historicized Plato, arguing that eternal forms must be understood as developing through time, that absolute truth is reached not by escaping history but by completing it. This is Platonism transformed by accepting what Plato denied, becoming change and temporality. Karl Marx, though materialist, remained influenced by Plato in unexpected ways. Marx's vision of communist society resembles Plato's ideal city: common ownership, abolition of the family for the ruling class, education determining social role. His critique of ideology, the idea that people mistake appearances for reality and need enlightenment to see truth, echoes the cave allegory. His historical materialism inverts Plato's idealism but preserves the structure. Both see reality as divided between surface appearance and hidden truth, accessible only through philosophy. Plato the aristocrat and Marx the revolutionary are strange bedfellows, but both are utopian thinkers seeking rational organization of society. Nietzsche launched the most savage modern attack on Plato. He saw Platonism as the origin of Western nihilism, the devaluation of this world in favor of an imaginary beyond, the denial of life in the name of abstract ideals. The theory of forms, Nietzsche argued, teaches us to despise the physical world, our bodies, our desires, everything that makes us human. Christianity is Platonism for the masses, and both must be overcome to affirm life. Yet Nietzsche could not escape Plato. He remained in constant dialogue with him, his philosophy defined by opposition to Platonism. 20th century Anglo-American philosophy, especially logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy, rejected Plato's metaphysics. Forms are nonsense, they said, metaphysical pseudo-problems that dissolve when we clarify language properly. Philosophy should not seek transcendent reality, but should analyze concepts, expose confusions, and accept that science provides our only knowledge of reality. This was anti-Platonism as methodology, rejecting the idea that philosophy has a special subject matter beyond what science and common sense already cover. Yet Platonism persisted even in analytic philosophy. Kurt Gödel, one of the greatest logicians, was an unapologetic Platonist about mathematical objects. He believed numbers and sets exist independently of human thought, that mathematical truth is discovered rather than invented. Many philosophers of mathematics remain Platonists, arguing that mathematical entities must exist in some sense to explain the objectivity and applicability of mathematics. The debate between Platonists and nominalists about abstract objects continues as vigorously as ever. Moral philosophy has seen a revival of Platonic approaches. 20th century virtue ethics, developed by philosophers like Jem Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Alistair MacIntyre, return to the question of how to live well and what character we should cultivate. While rejecting Plato's metaphysics, these philosophers accepted his framework that ethics is about human flourishing and requires development of virtue. They agreed that moral knowledge requires practical wisdom, that rules alone cannot guide action, that character matters more than isolated choices. This is Plato without the forms, but still recognizably Platonic in spirit. Political philosophy remains haunted by Plato's challenge. Karl Popper's warning that Platonism leads to totalitarianism made Plato a villain in liberal democratic theory. Yet even Popper's critics acknowledge that Plato identified real problems with democracy, the danger of demagoguery, the need for expertise in government, the difficulty of combining popular rule with wise rule. Contemporary debates about technocracy, about how much power unelected experts should have, about whether some decisions should be insulated from democratic pressure, are all variations on Platonic themes. Feminist philosophy has had a complex relationship with Plato. On one hand, his argument for gender equality in education and political participation was radical for his time and remains inspiring. On the other hand, his devaluation of the body, his association of matter with femininity and form with masculinity, his exclusion of women from most dialogues, reveal deep sexism. Feminist scholars debate whether Plato can be redeemed or whether his philosophy is irredeemably patriarchal. But they cannot ignore him. His influence on Western conceptions of reason, emotion, body and soul is too pervasive. Environmental philosophy often criticizes Platonic dualism. The split between eternal forms and changing physical world, between mind and body, between human reason and material nature, has been blamed for environmental destruction. If the physical world is mere appearance, less real than abstract truth, why care about it? If nature lacks inherent value, existing only as matter for human use, why preserve it? Deep ecologists argue that Western environmental crisis stems partly from Platonic metaphysics that devalues the natural world. But others respond that Plato's vision of cosmic order and beauty could support environmental ethics if properly interpreted. Educational theory returns constantly to Platonic themes. Should education aim at drawing out innate potential or shaping minds according to social needs? Should it focus on abstract knowledge or practical skills? Should it promote critical thinking, even if this challenges social stability? These are all questions Plato raised, and his answers, though often unsatisfying, set the terms of debate. The Socratic method remains influential in teaching. The idea that education should transform rather than just inform is Platonic, and the conviction that education determines the future of society comes from Plato. Cognitive science and artificial intelligence research encounter Platonic questions from unexpected angles. If concepts have structure independent of particular instances, as concepts of universal patterns suggest, this resembles forms. If reasoning follows abstract logical principles that hold regardless of content, this echoes eternal truth. Debate about whether artificial intelligence requires understanding abstract concepts or can operate on patterns in data reflects the ancient debate between Platonic rationalism and empiricism. The relationship between symbolic and sub-symbolic AI mirrors the relationship between forms and particulars. Psychology and therapy sometimes use Platonic frameworks. Carl Jung's archetypes resemble Platonic forms, universal patterns appearing in myths and dreams across cultures. Cognitive therapy's technique of examining and revising irrational beliefs has Socratic roots. The idea that self-knowledge is essential to well-being, that examining your life is not optional but necessary for good living, comes directly from Socrates and Plato. The ancient question of how to achieve harmony among different parts of the soul resurfaces in contemporary theories of mental health. Aesthetics cannot escape Plato's questions about art's relationship to truth and morality. Should art be beautiful or truthful, moving or instructive, pleasurable or improving? Can we judge art objectively, or is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Does representation in art succeed by resembling reality or create reality through imagination? Every major aesthetic theory from Renaissance to postmodernism is a response to questions Plato raised, even when claiming to reject his answers entirely. Contemporary metaphysics debates issues that Plato made central. Do properties exist independently of objects that have them? Are there abstract objects like numbers, sets and possibilities? What is the relationship between particular things and kinds of things? What makes something one thing rather than many? These technical debates in academic philosophy are descendants of Plato's theory of forms, exploring problems he identified even when rejecting solutions he proposed. Political movements have claimed Platonic legitimacy while betraying Platonic principles. Fascist regimes cited Plato's aristocratic ideals while creating brutal hierarchies. Communist states appealed to his vision of common property while establishing oppressive control. Technocrats invoke his respect for expertise while dismissing democratic participation. These misappropriations show the danger of Plato's ideas, but also their power. Even those who abuse philosophy must claim philosophical justification, and Plato provides the most comprehensive philosophical vision of political order in Western tradition. Religious thought outside Christianity has also engaged with Plato. Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes synthesized Platonism with Islamic theology, creating sophisticated metaphysics and epistemology. Jewish thinkers like Philo and Maimonides used Platonic frameworks to interpret scripture. These cross-cultural appropriations show that Platonic questions transcend their original context. They are human questions about reality, knowledge, goodness, and God that arise in any sufficiently developed philosophical tradition. Perhaps Plato's deepest legacy is making philosophy itself seem necessary and important. Before Plato, philosophy existed as scattered speculation by individual thinkers. Plato established philosophy as a systematic discipline with its own methods, problems and standards. He showed that philosophical questions are not just interesting puzzles, but urgent practical matters that determine how we live. He demonstrated that philosophy requires institutional support, hence the academy, and communal effort, hence the dialogues. He made philosophy central to civilization rather than marginal to it. The dark side of Plato's legacy must also be acknowledged. His influence on Christian asceticism contributed to body hatred and sexual repression. His political philosophy provided blueprints for authoritarian regimes. His epistemology encouraged intellectual elitism and contempt for ordinary people. His metaphysics created a split between appearance and reality that generated skepticism and nihilism. His devaluation of art and poetry impoverished Western aesthetics. Not every aspect of his influence has been beneficial, and some has been actively harmful. Yet we cannot simply reject Plato. His influence is too deeply embedded in Western thought. Our concepts of reality, knowledge, justice, beauty, love and soul all bear Platonic shape even when we deny Platonic content. The questions he asked remain our questions. The problems he identified remain our problems. The tensions in his thought remain our tensions. We are all Platonists, in some sense, even when we are anti-Platonists, because we cannot think about fundamental philosophical questions without using frameworks he established. The challenge for contemporary philosophy is to learn from Plato without being imprisoned by him. We should preserve his insights about objective truth, Moral reality, the life of the mind, the connection between personal and political virtue, the need for rational examination of life. But we must reject his authoritarianism, his hostility to democracy, his devaluation of the body and the physical world, his excessive intellectualism, his rigid hierarchies. This requires thinking with Plato while also thinking beyond him, honouring his achievement while recognizing his limitations. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is that great philosophy is always unfinished. Plato raised questions he could not answer, created problems he could not solve, proposed visions he could not justify. But by doing so brilliantly and honestly, he made philosophy possible for everyone who came after. His legacy is not a set of doctrines to accept or reject, but an invitation to think, to question, to seek truth, however difficult. He showed us what philosophy can be, a rigorous, passionate, relentless pursuit of understanding that transforms both thought and life. 2,400 years after his death, we are still reading Plato, still arguing with him, still finding in his works challenges and inspiration. We may never resolve the problems he raised, may never answer the questions he asked, may never achieve the knowledge he sought. But the attempt itself is valuable. The examination of life he insisted on is what makes us human. In that sense, we are all living in Plato's shadow, and that shadow, for all its darkness, also provides light. The light of reason, of questioning, of refusing to accept easy answers, of demanding that life and thought achieve coherence and truth. That is Plato's enduring gift to us, and it remains as precious and as challenging as ever.